The stasis bay doors closed at 0300 hours ship time. Eli Wallace stood in the corridor outside and listened to the sound they made, a deep hydraulic finality. The kind of sound that didn't leave room for second thoughts, because second thoughts required time, and time was the one thing he didn't have in any of the forms that mattered. 3 weeks of oxygen in the ship's remaining functional life support. One broken stasis pod that the finest minds on 2 galaxies had spent 72 hours failing to fix. 83 people sealed in suspension behind 2 meters of ancient alloy, their metabolisms reduced to the biological equivalent of a held breath, their lives extending forward through years of FTL travel without costing them a single heartbeat. And Eli Wallace, 25 years old, son of a nurse from Massachusetts, recruited off a video game couch by a government that had needed his mind and gotten considerably more than they'd bargained for. Standing alone in a corridor on a ship that was older than human civilization with nothing but 3 weeks and whatever he could think of. He stood there for a while. Not frozen, he'd done his freezing in the hours before, during the frantic final attempts on the pod. During the conversation with Rush that had produced no solution, and the conversation with Young that had produced a look the colonel couldn't quite hide, the look of a commander doing the math on an acceptable loss and finding the math unacceptable and being unable to change it regardless. He'd done his freezing when Chloe had pressed her palm flat against the stasis pod's interior surface, and he'd pressed his against the exterior, and the temperature differential between them had been the whole story of where things stood. He'd done his freezing. What he was doing now was something different, the specific stillness of someone who has moved through the worst moment and come out the other side into the strange flat country beyond it, where the absence of hope paradoxically produces a kind of clarity. He had 3 weeks. 3 weeks was 504 hours. 504 hours was 30,240 minutes. Expressed as minutes, it felt larger, which was probably why he'd expressed it that way. A habit of mind he recognized as the same one that had gotten him through every impossible problem in his life, by breaking it into components small enough to be addressed, one at a time. The pod was broken in a specific way. Specific ways had specific solutions. He hadn't found the solution yet. That was different from the solution not existing. He pushed off the wall and started walking. Destiny. At minimum, Power was a different ship than Destiny under full operation. Not smaller exactly, but more honest, the way a city feels different at 3 a.m. than at noon. Stripped of the ambient noise and activity that usually mediated between a person and the raw fact of the place. The corridors that normally carried the sounds of 80 people going about the impossible business of survival billions of light years from home were completely, absolutely silent. His boots on the deck plating. The low subsonic hum of the FTL drive doing the only thing it had been doing for 3 years, moving forward, always forward, toward a destination that the ship's own navigation system treated as inevitable and that every human aboard treated as theoretical. He went to the Destiny's hydroponics bay first because he needed to eat and because the act of doing a normal thing in an abnormal situation was a technique he'd developed aboard the ship. One of the psychological tools the crew had collectively built for maintaining function under conditions that human beings had not evolved to handle. Normal things. Meals at regular intervals. Sleep cycles maintained even when sleep felt impossible. The small rituals of ordinary life pressed against the extraordinary context of the situation like a hand pressed against a wound, not healing it, but keeping the pressure on. He made food. He ate it sitting in the chair that had become his chair over 2 years of meals in this room. Looking at the plants that Chloe had been tending for the last 6 months, with the focused devotion of someone who needed growing things around her and had found that tending them was a way of being useful that didn't require her to think about what was growing inside her own cells. He thought about Chloe for a moment. Then he put it in a specific interior location he'd developed for things he couldn't afford to think about right now, and turned his attention to the problem. The broken stasis pod was Unit 7. He'd cataloged everything about it in the 72 hours before the crew entered stasis, every diagnostic reading, every component assessment, every place where the ancient technology intersected with the modifications and repairs they'd made over 2 years with salvaged parts and human ingenuity, and the occasional miracle of actually understanding what they were looking. The failure was in the cryoregulation matrix, which was ancient engineering of a sophistication that sat at the intersection of biology and physics in a way that human technology hadn't reached yet. The matrix controlled the metabolic suspension field. Without it, the pod could seal, but couldn't maintain the suspended state. The occupant would simply die in a sealed box rather than sleeping, which was a distinction that mattered considerably. He'd identified 3 potential approaches in the 72 hours. All 3 had failed. But failure contained information, and information was what he built solutions from. And 3 weeks was 30,000 minutes. And he was the person who had translated the Stargate program's most complex mathematical proof from a video game. And he was absolutely not going to let 8 to 3 people sleep through whatever came next. Because he hadn't been smart enough, he pulled up his tablet. He opened Rush's shared research files, the ones the scientist had made available to the crew's general database, the sanitized, public-facing version of whatever was actually in Nicholas Rush's head. He stared at them for a while. Then he opened a new file, titled it Unit 7 Approach 4, and started writing. The ship hummed around him, ancient and patient, carrying its sleeping cargo through the dark between galaxies at a speed that made the word distance feel quaint. And outside the viewports, the stars were the wrong stars, the stars of a galaxy that no human being except the crew of this ship had ever seen from the inside, and they were falling away behind Destiny's drive plume at a rate that no instrument Eli had access to could meaningfully express. He wrote for 6 hours without stopping. At the end of the 6 hours, he had identified a 4th approach that was either brilliant or wrong in a way that would take another 6 hours of work to determine, and his coffee, the last of the real coffee, which he had been saving, which he had decided that this situation absolutely justified opening, was cold, and the hydroponics bay light had shifted from the blue-white of artificial morning to the amber of artificial afternoon, and Destiny was still moving forward the way it always moved forward. And Eli Wallace was still alive. He looked at what he'd written. "Okay," he said, to the empty ship, to the sleeping crew, to whatever version of the universe was listening. "Okay, I think I see it." His voice sounded strange in the silence, too present, too specific. A human sound in a space that had temporarily stopped being human. He'd need to get used to that. 3 weeks was a long time to be the only voice on a ship this size. He picked up his tablet and went to find the tools he needed, his footsteps echoing in corridors that had never been this quiet in the 2 years he'd been aboard. Past the closed doors of quarters where his friends were sleeping through years he would spend awake toward the broken thing that needed fixing. Because that was what you did when something was broken, and you were the only one there to fix it. That was, when he thought about it, more or less the story of how he'd ended up here in the first place. If you want to see more AI-completed storylines and what-if scenarios, hit that subscribe button and drop the show, the character, or the canceled storyline you want to see finished down in the comments below. Indeed, Rush's hidden files were not hidden in the way that secrets were usually hidden. They weren't encrypted beyond the standard Destiny database protocols. They weren't buried under false directory names, or disguised as maintenance logs, or protected by the kind of layered security that someone seriously concerned with concealment would have implemented. They were simply in a subdirectory labeled Personal Restricted, which on any Earth system would have been a meaningful barrier, and on Destiny, where the crew had spent 2 years developing the specific intimacy of people who had run out of privacy as a luxury and learned to respect it as a courtesy instead, functioned as the equivalent of a closed door. You didn't open it because you didn't open it, not because you couldn't. Eli technically had access to the full database since Brody gave him senior systems credentials 8 months ago after the incident with the Nakai probe that nobody had officially documented. He had never used those credentials to open Rush's personal directory because Rush was Rush difficult, brilliant, operating on a frequency that nobody else on the ship fully received, and because the closed-door principle had felt important to maintain even when, especially when, the person behind it was someone whose judgment you had complex feelings about. He opened it now because Rush wasn't behind it anymore. Rush was 17 pods down from Chloe, in the stasis bay. his metabolic rate reduced to the threshold of measurement, dreaming whatever Nicholas Rush dreamed when his consciousness was quiet enough to dream. The closed-door principle applied to living relationships. This was something else archaeology, almost. The excavation of what a person had known and chosen not to say, and the attempt to understand why. What he found took him 4 hours to fully process, and another 2 hours to accept. The directory contained 847 files spanning 3 years of work predating, Eli realized, with a chill that moved through him like cold water, Rush's arrival on Destiny. Some of these files had been created on Earth, some on the Icarus base, in the weeks before the attack that had sent them through the 9 Chevron address and changed everything. Rush had been working on this problem before he'd ever stepped through the gate, and the shape of what he'd been working on was not what the crew had been told. The official position, the position Rush had maintained in briefings, in conversations with Young, in the careful parceling out of information that had been one of the constants of their time on Destiny, was that the cosmic background radiation signal was a message. Patterns in the universe's oldest light that were too regular, too structured to be a natural phenomenon, evidence of intelligence. Evidence, possibly, of something that had existed before the universe's current form, that had encoded information into the fabric of reality at the moment of its creation and left it there for whoever developed the capacity to read it. This was true as far as it went. What the files showed was that it didn't go nearly far enough. Rush hadn't just identified the signal as a message. He had over 3 years of work that Eli could only characterize as obsessive in the specific way that genuine genius was obsessive, total, consuming, indifferent to the personal cost, decoded significant portions of it. Not all, not even most, but enough. Enough to know that the message wasn't simply evidence of intelligence. It was instructions, specifically structured, specifically addressed, requiring a specific receiver with specific capabilities to interpret the final layers. The receiver the message required was Destiny. Not a ship like Destiny, not ancient technology in general. This specific ship, with this specific configuration, carried this specific complement of systems that had been accumulating and evolving across millions of years of automated travel through galaxies that no one on the crew had names for. Destiny wasn't traveling toward the signal. Destiny was the instrument the signal's authors had built or anticipated or caused the distinctions blurred at this level of implication to receive and interpret the final transmission. Eli sat with this for a long time. Then he went back to the files and read everything again from the beginning, because the first reading had been colored by the shock of it, and the second reading needed to be cleaner. The second reading was cleaner and worse. Worse, not because the implications had changed, but because they came into sharper focus, and sharper focus meant confronting the specific decisions Rush had made about what to share and what to keep. The crew had been told, signal, message, evidence of creator intelligence, Destiny's mission to find the source. They had not been told. The signal had layers that Rush had already partially decoded. They had not been told. The final layer required Destiny to reach a specific set of coordinates that Rush had calculated 18 months ago and had been navigating toward, without announcing. They had not been told. The message's decoded portions contained information about the nature of what had sent it, that Rush had read, and evidently found too significant, too destabilizing, too potentially fracturing to the crew's already strained cohesion to share. There was a file near the end of the directory, dated 4 months ago, titled simply, What It Means. Eli opened it. It was not a research document. It was not a technical analysis or a mathematical proof or any of the forms Rush's thinking usually took when he committed it to writing. It was 3 paragraphs, written in the compressed, precise prose of someone who had spent so long thinking in equations that ordinary language felt imprecise, but who had needed to say something in ordinary language because equations couldn't carry it. The signal is not a message in the conventional sense. It is not communication between parties. It is the record of a process specifically, the process by which conscious complexity emerges from physical law, repeated across the universe's history at intervals that the signal itself documents. The authors of the signal did not send it to us. They sent it forward, into the universe they were creating, or had created, or exist outside of in ways that the mathematics can describe, but that language cannot. They sent it forward because they wanted whoever developed the capacity to receive it to know. This has happened before. Consciousness has emerged before. It has faced what you are facing before. And there is a next step. I have not shared this because I am not certain the crew can bear it. Not the discovery. The responsibility. I am also not certain I am wrong to withhold it. That uncertainty is the most honest thing I can say. Eli read the 3 paragraphs 4 times. Then he closed the file and sat in Rush's chair in Rush's workspace, a corner of the Destiny's research lab that had been Rush's territory so completely and for so long that it still smelled faintly of the man, of coffee, and worked metal, and the specific atmosphere of a mind that never fully disengaged and thought about Nicholas Rush in a way he hadn't before. Not as an obstacle or an antagonist, or the difficult, brilliant, necessary problem that the crew had been managing since day one. As a person who had found out something so large that he'd carried it alone for 4 months because he couldn't figure out what putting it down would cost everyone else. Eli understood this impulse better than he would have liked. He looked at the tablet in his hands. Approach 4 for Unit 7 was still open in another window. 12 pages of dense technical reasoning that was either the solution to the broken stasis pod or the most sophisticated dead end he'd ever constructed. He looked at Rush's files. He looked at the approach. The approach required something he'd been circling around for 6 hours without fully acknowledging a component from Destiny's secondary cryosystems that was theoretically accessible but located in a section of the Destiny's ship that had been sealed since the fire in the 3rd month. A section that the crew had collectively decided was too structurally compromised to enter safely and had marked on the ship's map in red and left marked in red and not revisited. He looked at the sealed section on his tablet's ship schematic. He looked at it for a long time. "Okay, Rush," he said, to the empty research lab, to the sleeping scientist's 17 pods from Chloe, to the 3 paragraphs in the file titled, "What It Means. You carried yours alone. I'll carry mine alone too." He paused. "For now." He stood up, pocketed his tablet, picked up a toolkit from the lab supply shelf, and added a portable atmospheric sensor and a structural integrity scanner to the toolkit because he was not an idiot, and walked toward the sealed section with the specific quality of purpose that emerges when there is nobody left to stop you and nothing left to lose except everything, which was the same condition that had defined his entire time on this ship and which he had, somewhere in the last 2 years, stopped experiencing as frightening and started experiencing as simply the medium he operated in. The red section was 4 corridors away. He counted his steps as he walked, because counting was a thing his mind did when it needed something to do that wasn't panic, and arrived at the sealed door to find it exactly as sealed as the schematic had indicated and exactly as sealed as common sense had always suggested it would be. He ran the structural scanner over the doorframe. The readings were not good. They were not catastrophic either. The frame was compromised, but not critically. The structural integrity, sitting at 67%, which was well below the 85% standard that SGC engineers had established as the safe threshold for entry, and well above the 40%. That meant the corridor would collapse when you breathed on it. 67% was a number that a sensible person would look at and say, "Not today." Eli looked at it and said, "I've worked with worse." He began bypassing the door seal, his fingers moving through the ancient interface with the practiced ease of 2 years of necessity, and thought about Rush's 3 paragraphs, and thought about the component he needed, and thought about 83 people sleeping through years in the bay, 4 corridors behind him, and did not think about the fact that if the structural integrity scanner was slightly miscalibrated, he would have no way of knowing until the corridor made the point for him. The door seal disengaged. The door opened. The corridor beyond was dark and cold and smelled of old burning and the specific staleness of sealed space, and Eli's portable light picked out the shapes of damage along the walls, scorched surfaces, a section of conduit that had warped in the fire's heat and set that way, a collapsed section of ceiling 20 meters ahead that had been the reason the area was sealed in the first place. The component he needed was 30 meters past the collapsed ceiling. He took a breath. He checked the atmospheric sensor breathable, marginally, the scrubbers still working at reduced capacity in this section, as they worked everywhere on the ship. doing their patient automated job regardless of whether anyone was present to benefit from it. "Okay," he said. He went in. The collapsed ceiling section was worse up close than it had looked from 20 meters. Not catastrophically worse, the kind of worse that meant the situation was manageable rather than impossible, which was a distinction Eli had spent 2 years learning to make with some precision. The collapse had happened in a specific way. The primary support beam had given first, which had brought down the ceiling panels on the left side of the corridor in a cascade that had then partially blocked the right side when the panels hit the floor and fragmented. The result was not a wall of debris but a maze of it, irregular gaps between fallen panels, some large enough to pass through if you moved carefully, some that looked large enough and weren't. The structural integrity of the whole arrangement dependent on variables that his scanner could approximate but not resolve completely. He scanned it for 4 minutes before moving. The scanner said, the left side gap at approximately 2 meters height was structurally stable at 71%. The floor beneath the debris field was intact. The ceiling above the gap was supported by a secondary beam that had not failed and showed no immediate failure indicators. The risk was real, specifically located in a section of the right wall where the fire damage had compromised the bonding between the wall panel and the underlying structure, and could be managed by not touching that section, which he noted on his tablet with a red circle and the annotation, "Do not touch this," and felt slightly ridiculous about, and did anyway, because ridiculous or not, it was good practice. He went through the left side gap at 2 meters height on his stomach, pushing his toolkit ahead of him. The portable light clipped to his collar, casting moving shadows across the debris field in ways that his hindbrain interpreted as movement and his forebrain overruled as physics. The beam above him was solid. The floor beneath his hands was solid. The gap was tighter than it had looked from the other side by approximately 15%, which was the universe's standard markup on every physical challenge that looked manageable from a distance. He came through the other side with a scrape along his left shoulder that would bruise and a fine coating of ancient dust that was probably older than humanity and definitely not doing his respiratory situation any favors. He stood up. He checked the atmospheric sensor. He checked the structural scanner. He looked at the corridor ahead. 30 meters of dark, cold, damaged corridor between him and the component that Approach 4 required. He could see, in the portable light's reach, that the damage thinned out past the collapsed section the fire had originated somewhere behind him, and this section had caught the edge of it. Structural damage concentrated near the collapse point and diminishing as he moved forward. The corridor ahead was accessible in the way that most things on Destiny were accessible. Not safely, exactly, but workably. Which was as much as you got on a ship that had been running automated for millions of years and showed it. He walked the 30 meters, counting steps 28, as it turned out, his strides slightly longer than his standard estimate. A discrepancy, he noted, without knowing why he noted it, except that his mind collected data the way some people collected receipts, compulsively and without a fully articulated rationale. The secondary cryosystems junction was where the schematic said it was, which was not something he took for granted on Destiny, where the relationship between the schematic and the reality was more of a respectful suggestion than a binding agreement. It was a wall-mounted panel approximately a meter wide, sealed with the standard ancient interface he'd been opening versions of for 2 years, housing the cryo-regulation backup components that the main systems had been drawing on since the primary array had degraded 18 months ago. He opened the panel. The component he needed was there. He looked at it for a moment, just looked at it, because it was what he'd come for, and the sight of it produced a specific relief that he allowed himself to feel completely before moving past it. The relief of a problem that had been theoretical became practical. You could work with practicality. He pulled out his toolkit and started. It took 90 minutes to extract the component without damaging it, which was 40 minutes longer than his estimate and 30 minutes shorter than his pessimistic estimate, which meant he was operating within normal parameters for Eli Wallace working alone on ancient technology in a structurally compromised section of a ship billions of light years from the nearest qualified second opinion. He made the trip back through the collapsed section faster than the trip in familiarity with the specific geometry of the gap and the focused urgency of someone carrying something irreplaceable through a space where dropping it would be a category of disaster he declined to model. He came through with the component intact. his left shoulder complaining about the second transit through the same scrape point, the ancient dust redistributed from his front to his back. He sealed the section door behind him. He stood in the corridor outside it and breathed for a moment. Just breathed. The atmospheric sensor confirming that the air here was better than in the sealed section, which wasn't saying much, but was saying something. Then his tablet chimed. He looked at it. Destiny's navigation system had flagged an automated alert, the kind the ship generated without human input, the kind that meant something had changed in the external sensor picture that the ancient programming considered worth noting. He'd set the alert thresholds himself 2 weeks ago, calibrating them to catch anything significant, while avoiding the constant low-level notifications that Destiny's sensors produced as a matter of course. He'd set the threshold at significant. Whatever had triggered it met that bar. He walked quickly back toward the bridge, the component tucked under his arm, his mind splitting between the problem he'd been working on and the new one announcing itself. The specific cognitive multitasking that had been his baseline mode of operation since approximately day 3 aboard this ship. The bridge was a 4-minute walk from the sealed section at his current pace. He did it in 3. The main screen was showing an FTL dropout alert. Not scheduled. Destiny's FTL drives operated on their own logic. The ship dropped out when it found something worth stopping for, when its fuel needs required it, when the navigation system made decisions that the crew had learned to interpret rather than override. But this dropout was different. The navigation display showed an intercept course rather than a proximity stop. Destiny hadn't slowed down because it had found something interesting. It had slowed down because something had intersected its path. Something with a transponder. Eli stared at the transponder signal for a long moment. The frequency was ancient. Specifically ancient, the deep band automated beacon frequency that Destiny itself used, the frequency the seed ships used, the frequency that meant this signal was coming from something that had left the same dock, followed the same mission parameters, been built by the same hands that had built the ship he was standing on. He pulled up the signal analysis. The beacon was damaged intermittent, breaking up in the specific pattern of a power system running well below its design parameters, broadcasting on backup rather than primary power. It was also distant. The sensors put it at approximately 2.3 million kilometers off Destiny's port bow, which was close enough for the ancient sensors to resolve detail and far enough that whatever was out there had been drifting for some time without the power to correct its course. He enhanced the visual feed. The shape that resolved on the main screen was immediately, unmistakably recognizable to anyone who had spent time studying Destiny's design philosophy, the same aesthetic, the same fundamental architectural language, bigger than Destiny in some sections and smaller in others. Clearly ancient in the way that things become ancient when they've been doing their job in deep space for longer than recorded history. The hull was damaged, scored by weapons fire in several places, one entire section dark and clearly non-functional. Solar collection panels partially deployed in the emergency power configuration that meant the main power systems were offline. A seed ship. One of the automated vessels Destiny had been following across the universe, the ships that had preceded Destiny through each galaxy, seeding stargates on viable worlds, preparing the path, doing the advance work of a mission that had been running since before humanity had discovered fire. They'd encountered seed ships before. They'd boarded one. They'd used one as a tactical asset in the battle with the Nakai, but those encounters had been in places where the seed ships were functional, operational, doing their designed work. This one was not doing its designed work. This one was drifting. Eli ran the weapons damage analysis automatically because 2 years had made tactical assessment reflexive, and the results came back in under a minute. The scoring on the hull was consistent with the drone weapons, the automated defense ships that had been hunting Destiny since they'd wandered into their territory. The machine intelligence that had decided Destiny represented a threat to biological life and had been trying to eliminate it with the patient. Relentless efficiency of something that had no other purpose and no capacity for reconsidering that purpose. The drones had hit this seed ship, hit it hard and repeatedly in the specific pattern of a sustained engagement rather than a passing attack. Whatever the seed ship had done to draw that kind of attention, it had done it thoroughly enough that the drones had spent real resources on the response. He thought about that for a moment. Drones targeted Destiny and things associated with Destiny. A seed ship was associated with Destiny. Same origin, same mission parameters, same fundamental design signature. But the drones had been engaging this ship specifically enough to damage it this badly, which meant the seed ship had given them a reason beyond simple association. What could a seed ship do that would make the drone command ship spend that kind of resource eliminating it? He didn't have an answer. He had a strong suspicion that the answer was aboard the seed ship, in whatever section of it was still functional and still worth the drone's continued attention. He looked at the distance reading. 2.3 million kilometers. Destiny had a shuttle, one functional shuttle, which he'd been treating as a last resort resource and had been careful not to use for anything that didn't absolutely require it, because one shuttle was a resource with no margin for error. Using it now, for this, meant committing to the trip and committing to whatever he found when he got there, with no backup and no one to consult, and the knowledge that if something went wrong, the 83 people in the stasis bay would simply continue sleeping until Destiny reached its destination or something stopped it. He also had Rush's files. Specifically, he had the navigational data Rush had embedded in his private research, the coordinates Rush had been steering toward without announcing, the endpoint of the signal's decoded trajectory. He'd been running that data in the background since he'd found it, cross-referencing it against Destiny's own navigation records to see where they converged. They converged approximately 6 months ahead, at their current FTL speed. 6 months. He had 3 weeks of oxygen. He looked at the seed ship on the screen. He looked at the component under his arm. He looked at the stasis bay corridor visible through the bridge doorway. The door at its end, sealed and solid, and containing 83 people who were counting on him in a way they didn't know about because they were asleep. He did not look at the math on the oxygen situation, because he'd done that math already, and doing it again would not change the result, and the result was the result. "Okay," he said. He put the component carefully on the navigator's console. He sat down in the pilot's seat. Young's seat, technically, but Young was asleep, and the seat was here, and he needed to sit down while he thought. Okay, one problem at a time. He pulled up the shuttle prep checklist and started working through it. The seed ship drifted at 2.3 million kilometers, its damaged beacon pulsing in the irregular rhythm of something running on the last of what it had, and Destiny held position in the void between galaxies with its sleeping crew and its one wakeful mind. And outside the viewports, the stars that no human had named stretched in every direction to a distance that made the concept of distance feel like a personal problem rather than a physical fact. Eli worked through the checklist. He was on item 14 of 47 when Destiny's long-range sensors added a second contact to the tactical display. Not a beacon this time, not something drifting, something moving, on an intercept course with the seed ship, coming from a direction that the sensor analysis flagged in the specific color he'd assigned to the contact type that made his stomach drop every time he saw it, regardless of how many times he'd seen it. The drones had found the seed ship again, and now they'd found Destiny too. The drone contact was not a scout. Eli had learned to read drone formations the way the crew had learned to read everything on Destiny through exposure and consequence. The hard empirical education of people who couldn't afford to misinterpret what their sensors were telling them. Scout formations were single contacts or pairs, moving fast, the drone equivalent of reconnaissance. What the tactical display was showing him now was a formation of 11 contacts in the wedge configuration that he'd cataloged from the battle records as an assault pattern, the arrangement the drones used when they'd cross, identified a target, and committed resources to its elimination. 11 drones, one seed ship already damaged and running on backup power, and one ancient vessel with a skeleton crew of 1 operating at minimum power, with 83 people sealed in stasis and a functional weapon complement that required at minimum 4 people to operate at combat effectiveness. He had 3 minutes before the drone formation reached effective weapons range of the seed ship. He had approximately 8 minutes before they reached Destiny. He did not panic. He had discovered, over 2 years, that panic was a state he moved through rather than stayed in it. Arrived, it did its work of forcing his adrenal system into high gear, and then his mind came back online and took over. The transition from panic to function had gotten faster. This time it took approximately 4 seconds, which was the best he'd managed and which he noted with the detached professionalism of someone keeping performance metrics on their own crisis response. He pulled up Destiny's weapons systems. The main cannons were offline. Minimum power configuration had taken them down along with most of the ship's non-essential systems when the crew had entered stasis. Bringing them back online from this console would take 12 minutes of reinitialization, which was 4 minutes more than he had before the drones reached the seed ship and 8 minutes less than he had before they reached Destiny, which meant the math on defending the seed ship didn't work and the math on defending Destiny was marginal at best. He looked at the weapons interface. He looked at the drone formation. He looked at the seed ship beacon pulsing its irregular distress in the lower left of the tactical display. Then he looked at something else, a system he'd been aware of but had been treating as a contingency, a last resort. A thing you didn't touch unless there was genuinely no alternative, because the alternative was always preferable if it existed. Destiny's FTL drive, not for transit. For something that Rush had identified in the ship's technical documentation 18 months ago and that had been discussed exactly once in a crew meeting and then filed away because the situation it addressed had not arisen. Destiny's FTL drive, at full power, generated a field during spin-up that extended approximately 400,000 kilometers from the ship's hull in all directions. The field was a byproduct of the drive mechanics. The mass effect distortion required to initiate FTL transit created a bubble of altered physics that was, for approximately 90 seconds during the spin-up cycle, intensely hostile to anything with the kind of automated electronic systems the drones used. It wasn't a weapon. Rush had been careful about that in the meeting. Emphatic, actually, in the way he was emphatic when he thought someone was about to misunderstand something important. It was a field effect with tactical implications, which was different. The distinction was real. A weapon was a thing you aimed, a thing with intent. This was physics doing what physics did, with consequences that happened to be useful. The drone command ship, wherever it was, had presumably modeled this. They'd faced Destiny's FTL spin-up before. But the 11 drones in the assault formation were operating on the edge of the field's effective range, and the seed ship was at 2.3 million kilometers, which was inside the field's outer boundary. He ran the calculation. If he spun up the FTL drive, now not to transit, but to the 40% threshold where the field effect reached its maximum extent, without actually initiating the jump, the field would reach the seed ship's position in approximately 90 seconds. It would disrupt the drone formation's coordination for the same window. It would not destroy the drones. It would not stop them permanently. But it would buy time. Specifically the kind of time that was worth buying, the 90 seconds between the drones reaching the seed ship and doing what they'd come to do to it. 90 seconds was not much. 90 seconds was what he had. He initiated the FTL spin-up sequence at minimum transit threshold and immediately opened every internal comm channel on the ship. "This is Eli," he said, to the empty corridors, to the sealed stasis bay, to the ship generally. He had no idea why he said it. There was nobody to hear it, nobody who would answer. But the act of speaking his own name into the ship's comm system was something, some small claim on the reality of the situation, some insistence that a person was here and making decisions, and those decisions would have his name on them. Running a defensive FTL spin-up, drones incoming, I've got this. He did not know if he had this. He said it anyway. The 90 seconds were the longest 90 seconds of his life, which was a meaningful statement given his personal history with long 90-second intervals. The FTL field expanded outward from Destiny's hull in the way that drive fields expanded invisibly, undetectably by any human sense, legible only through the sensor readings that tracked its propagation and through the effect it had on the drone formation's behavior. The effect was visible on the tactical display within 40 seconds of spin-up. The clean wedge formation began to break up. Individual drone contacts, deviating from their projected courses as their coordination systems encountered the field interference, not disabled, not destroyed. Confused, in whatever sense that word applied to automated systems built by a machine intelligence, their targeting and coordination data suddenly unreliable, their attack pattern disrupted at the moment of its execution. The seed ship's beacon continued its irregular pulse. At 70 seconds, 2 of the 11 drone contacts broke off entirely, moving away from the seed ship, recalculating. Their logic presumably identifying the FTL field's source and making the tactical determination that the source was the higher priority target. They turned toward destiny. Eli watched them turn. He had the weapon's reinitialization running in parallel on a secondary console, 6 minutes remaining on the 12-minute process. Reduced by the power he'd redirected from non-essential systems in the 40 seconds since he'd started the sequence. 6 minutes was too long. He needed something that was ready now. He looked at what was ready now. Destiny had one system that was always at operational readiness, regardless of power configuration. The system that Rush had called the ship's most fundamental survival mechanism, and that everyone else called the weapon that fired whether you wanted it to or not. The automated defense grid, 48-point defense turrets distributed across Destiny's hull, independently powered, independently targeted, responsive to proximity threats without requiring human input. They'd caused problems before their threat assessment logic was ancient and occasionally incomprehensible. They'd targeted things the crew hadn't considered threats and ignored things that demonstrably were. But against drones, which the ancient systems categorized correctly and immediately, they were effective within their range. Their range was 50,000 kilometers. The two drones turning toward Destiny were at 340,000 kilometers and closing. He had approximately 4 minutes before they entered the defense grid's effective range. 4 minutes was also approximately when the weapon's reinitialization would complete on 3 of the 4 main cannons. He looked at the math. The math worked. Barely, conditionally, dependent on the drones, continuing their current approach vector, and the reinitialization completing on schedule, and the defense grid performing at the 73% efficiency he'd calculated from the battle records, rather than the FLACE. 60% pessimistic estimate he'd also run. He looked at the seed ship on the display. The drone formation there had also broken up 7 contacts now scattered from their original positions, the field interference doing what the field interference did, buying the 90 seconds he'd needed. The seed ship was still intact, still broadcasting its damaged beacon. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The FTL spin-up reached its threshold and held Destiny trembling slightly around him with the contained energy of a drive that wanted to fire and was being told to wait. The ship's systems, registering the sustained threshold as an anomaly and filing automated complaints that he would have found funny under different circumstances. He acknowledged the complaints. He held the threshold. He watched the drone formation near the seed ship continue its recalculation and felt, from 2 million kilometers away, the specific satisfaction of a plan working in the precise window it needed to work in. Then the third console chimed. He looked at it. The seed ship's beacon had changed. Not its frequency. The deep-band ancient signal was the same. But the content had changed. The automated distress pattern replaced by something structured. Something that was not automated in the way that distress beacons were automated but deliberate, constructed. A transmission that was using the beacon's channel to carry information that beacons weren't designed to carry. Someone was using the seed ship's damaged beacon to send a message. Not the ship. The ship was running on backup power with most of its systems offline. Something on the ship was using the minimal available power to push a signal through the only channel it had. He pulled up the translation matrix, the ancient language decoding system that Rush had spent 18 months refining into something that could handle the deep dialect variations in Destiny's era of ancient technology, and ran it against the transmission. The translation came back in segments, incomplete in places where the signal broke up, and the matrix filled in gaps with probability estimates, but coherent enough that the core content was unmistakable. He read it twice. Then he read it a third time, because the third time was when his mind finished arguing with itself about whether the translation could possibly be accurate, and arrived at the conclusion that the matrix's confidence rating was 94%, and 94% was not a number you argued with. The message was from the seed ship's archive system. Not a person, not a crew. Seed ships were automated, unmanned, had always been unmanned. But the archive system was something more than a simple database. Rush had theorized this in one of the files Eli had read that morning, the idea that Destiny-era ancient technology operated at a level of sophisticated automation that blurred the line between programmed response and genuine cognition that the Siege ship's archive systems might have developed something like memory over millions of years of operation, something like perspective, something like the specific intelligence that emerged from sufficiently complex pattern recognition applied to sufficiently complex data over sufficiently long time. The message the archive was sending was this: we have been waiting. The coordinates were updated 14,000 years ago. The final gate was placed. Destiny must receive what we carried. The drones must not prevent this. Please, hurry. Eli read it a fourth time. He looked at the drone contacts on the tactical display, the 2 turning toward Destiny, the 7 near the Siege ship recalculating from the field disruption. All of them patient and relentless, in the way that things without biological urgency were patient and relentless. He looked at the components sitting on the navigator's console. Approach 4 for Unit 7, the broken stasis pod, the 83 people sleeping through everything. He looked at the message. The final gate was placed. A Stargate. The Siege ship had placed a Stargate that was its function. That was what all of them had been doing across all the galaxies Destiny had passed through. But a final gate, specifically, positioned at coordinates that had been updated 14,000 years ago by something or someone that had known where Destiny was going and had prepared the last step of the path 14,000 years ago. He pulled up Rush's navigational files. The coordinates Rush had decoded from the signal's transmission, the endpoint, 6 months ahead. He cross-referenced them against the coordinates the Siege ship's archive had just transmitted as the location of the final gate. They matched. Of course they matched. He put his head in his hands for exactly 10 seconds, which was the amount of time he permitted himself. And then he raised his head and looked at the tactical display and started solving the immediate problem, because the immediate problem was drones and weapons reinitialization and a Siege ship that was apparently carrying something Destiny needed and had been waiting for millions of years to deliver. Everything else could wait until the drones weren't an issue. He pulled up the weapons console. 2 minutes, he said to the reinitialization progress bar. Come on. The progress bar moved at the pace of progress bars everywhere, indifferent to urgency, faithful only to process, the most democratic force in the universe. Outside, in the dark between galaxies, the drones closed the distance with the same indifferent patience, and Destiny held its spin-up threshold and trembled with contained energy. And the Siege ship drifted and waited, and somewhere in its damaged systems, the archive that had been waiting 14,000 years for this moment continued to transmit its message into the void on the only channel it had left. Please hurry. The weapons reinitialization completed at 4 minutes and 47 seconds. Not the 6 minutes the progress bar had projected, and not the 4 minutes he'd needed. 4 minutes 47, which landed in the gap between those two numbers in the specific way that things landed in gaps when the universe was making a point about the relationship between planning and reality. The 2 drones were at 68,000 kilometers when the first cannon came online, at 71,000 when the second locked, at 74,000 when the third completed its initialization sequence and the weapons console shifted from amber standby to the green active state. That was one of the more satisfying visual transitions Eli had encountered in 2 years of crisis management. 3 cannons, 2 drones at 74,000 kilometers, and closing. He fired the moment the targeting system achieved lock. The first shot hit the lead drone at 71,000 kilometers, close enough that Destiny's external cameras caught the impact bloom, a brief, fierce light in the dark that the sensors resolved as a direct hit on the drone's propulsion section. The drone didn't stop. It slowed, visibly, its approach vector flattening as its drive system compensated for the damage, but it continued closing, and its own weapons were charging, and the targeting system was already tracking the charge buildup as a countdown rather than a warning. The second shot hit the same drone before it could fire. The impact bloom was larger this time, a cascading failure in the drone's power systems, the charge that had been building for its weapon discharging internally rather than externally. A contained catastrophe that the sensors tracked through 3 seconds of structural collapse before the contact disappeared from the tactical display entirely. The second drone broke off. Not destroyed, it turned hard, The kind of vector change that something without biological passengers could execute, and something with them couldn't, pulling away from Destiny with an acceleration that the sensors tracked as emergency retreat rather than tactical repositioning. Eli watched it go with the specific wariness of someone who understood that broken off was not the same as gone, and that the drone's command intelligence was already processing the engagement and updating its models, and would have a response that accounted for today's outcomes whenever it decided to come back. He let it go. He had 2 drones near the seed ship still executing their recalculation from the FTL field disruption. He had the field itself still active at spin-up threshold. Destiny trembling around him with the sustained energy of a held breath. He had 3 functional cannons and a seed ship that the drones were going to return to once their recalculation resolved and the field effect dissipated. He looked at the distance to the seed ship, 2.3 million kilometers. Unchanged. Destiny had been holding position since the FTL dropout, the navigation system waiting for whatever input it was waiting for. He looked at the shuttle prep checklist on the secondary console. 47 items, item 14 still blinking for his attention. He did the math on the shuttle. The shuttle would take approximately 4 hours to reach the seed ship at its maximum safe speed through the field effect's outer boundary. 4 hours was a long time, with 2 drones recalculating at the seed ship's position and a command ship somewhere in the sensor picture that the long-range display wasn't resolving clearly enough to locate with confidence. It was also 4 hours away from the broken stasis pod. Away from Approach 4, away from the oxygen math that was always running in the background of everything else. He did a different version of the math. If he brought Destiny to the seed ship instead of taking the shuttle to it, FTL wasn't viable at this range, but the sublight drives were operational. And at full sublight, Destiny could cover 2.3 million kilometers in approximately 40 minutes. He could get there faster, keep the weapons online, maintain the FTL field's protective effect across the whole transit, and arrive with something considerably more capable than a shuttle if the drones were waiting. He looked at the sublight drive interface. He had never piloted Destiny alone. This was not a small caveat. Destiny's piloting was typically a 2-person minimum operation, 1 on navigation, 1 on propulsion, with a 3rd on sensors during anything more complicated than routine FTL transit. He'd piloted the shuttle solo. He'd handled emergency navigation corrections from the main console twice. He had never executed a sustained sublight approach to a specific contact while managing weapons and the FTL field effect and monitoring the sensor picture for drone contacts. He thought about this for approximately 8 seconds. Then he thought about what the seed ship's archive had said. Please hurry. He sat down in the pilot's seat, spread his hands across the navigation and propulsion interfaces simultaneously in the configuration that Rush called the cowboy setup and that Young called reckless, and that Eli had always privately thought was the only way to fly this ship that made any real sense, and began the sublight approach. Destiny moved. It moved the way it always moved, not gracefully, exactly, because grace implied an awareness of its own scale that the ship lacked, but with a purposeful mass that covered distance in a way that made distance feel like a solved problem. The sublight drives pushed 48,000 tons of ancient vessel through the void between galaxies at 0.003% of light speed, which was both extraordinarily fast by any human engineering standard and deeply inadequate relative to the distances involved. And the gap between the ship and the seed ship closed on the navigation display in the specific way that gaps closed when the numbers were large enough that progress felt abstract until suddenly it didn't. He used the 40 minutes to work. The weapon stayed hot. He'd written a macro that would alert him to any change in the drone contact's approach vectors and had set it to a tone loud enough to cut through concentration, which freed his primary attention for the secondary console where Approach 4 was waiting. The component from the sealed section sat on the navigator's console beside him. He'd run the initial integration analysis during the weapons engagement. In the 30-second gaps between targeting solutions, the specific parallel processing that his brain had developed as a survival mechanism and that he'd stopped apologizing for when he realized it was the most useful thing about him. Approach 4 required the component to interface with Unit 7's cryo-regulation matrix through a modification to the power routing that he'd designed to bypass the failed primary system entirely. The concept was sound. He'd stress-tested the logic 7 times, and it held each time. The execution was the uncertainty. Ancient cryoregulation matrices were not systems that tolerated improvisation. They were calibrated to tolerances that the ancient engineers had presumably spent considerable time establishing, and modifying the power routing meant operating outside those tolerances in ways that the matrix's own diagnostic systems would flag as errors and attempt to correct, potentially overriding his modification before it had time to demonstrate that it worked. He needed to modify the routing faster than the matrix could respond. He'd calculated the window at approximately 4.3 seconds, the time between his modification completing and the matrix's diagnostic cycle running. 4.3 seconds was tight. It was achievable. It required him to be at the pod, with the component installed, executing the modification sequence without error, while also being completely alone with no one to run the secondary interface that the process technically required to be operated simultaneously. He'd been working on this problem. The solution he'd arrived at was inelegant and effective, which was his preferred combination. He would pre-stage the secondary interface commands on his tablet, set to execute on a delayed trigger that he would activate the moment he began the primary modification. The 0.8 second delay calibrated to produce the simultaneous operation that the process required. He'd tested the trigger system 4 times. It worked 4 times. 4 for 4 was not a guarantee, but it was a basis for action. He filed the approach in the Unit 7 folder and moved back to the navigation console as Destiny closed the final 400,000 kilometers to the seed ship's position. The seed ship resolved on the external cameras in the specific way that ancient vessels resolved familiar and strange simultaneously. The same design language as Destiny, but applied to a different set of functions. A different scale, a different history. Up close, the weapons damage was worse than the long-range assessment had suggested. 2 entire hull sections were dark and cold, their power systems clearly offline. The solar collection panels were deployed in emergency configuration on every functional section, drinking in the thin starlight of intergalactic space at the marginal efficiency that deep void solar collection always produced. The seed ship was alive the way something was alive when it had been working very hard to stay that way for a long time. He brought Destiny to a position 50,000 kilometers off the seed ship's port side, close enough for the boarding umbilical to reach if they extended it. Far enough to maintain tactical separation and cut the sublight drives to station keeping. The drone contacts near the seed ship were still recalculating. The FTL field was still active. He had a window. He opened the communication channel to the seed ship's beacon frequency and transmitted on the same band the archive had been using. "This is Eli Wallace," he said. "I got your message. I'm here. What do you need me to do?" The response came back in 12 seconds, fast enough that the archive system had clearly been monitoring for exactly this contact, waiting for it. With whatever patience, a 14,000-year-old automated intelligence developed across 14,000 years of waiting. The translation matrix processed it in 8 seconds. "There is a person aboard. She has been in stasis for 11,000 years. The pod is failing. She must be moved to Destiny before the drones return. She carries the final coordinates in her memory." The signal's authors gave them to her directly. She is the last of the ones who went back. Eli stared at the translation for a long time. Not a thing the seed ship was carrying. Not data, or technology, or a physical object. A person. A person who had been in stasis for 11,000 years, placed on an automated seed ship by whoever had sent the cosmic background radiation signal, carrying in her memory the final coordinates that Rush's decoded data had been approaching from the outside, and that apparently only existed in their complete form inside a human mind that had received them from the signals. Authors, directly. He thought about Rush's 3 paragraphs. The signal is not a message in the conventional sense. He thought about the file titled, "What It Means." He thought about the word, responsibility. "Okay," he said, "to the archive, to the empty bridge, to the 11,000-year-old situation that had just become his immediate practical problem. I need to know the condition of the pod. I need the stasis system specs. And I need to know if your docking systems are functional enough to accept a boarding umbilical. The archive responded in 4 seconds. The pod is at 12% function. You have approximately 6 hours before critical failure. The docking system on Section 3 is functional. We have been waiting for Destiny for a very long time. Thank you for coming. He looked at the tactical display. The drone contacts were still recalculating. He looked at the oxygen math running in the background. He looked at the component on the navigator's console. He looked at the stasis bay corridor on the internal cameras sealed. Still, the door solid and unchanging. 6 hours. He had a person to retrieve from a failing stasis pod on a damaged seed ship with drones in the vicinity, a broken stasis pod on Destiny that he hadn't fixed yet, 3 weeks of oxygen, and a ship full of sleeping people who had no idea any of this was happening. He extended the boarding umbilical. It connected to the seed ship's Section 3 docking port with the solid resonant clunk of ancient engineering meeting. Ancient engineering, the two vessels joined by a corridor of pressurized tube and locked collar that his structural scanner confirmed as airtight at 98.7% integrity. He picked up his toolkit. He added the atmospheric sensor and the structural scanner and the portable medical kit that Dr. Volker had shown him the basics of during the long, boring stretch 3 months ago when they'd had nothing else to do, and Volker had decided that basic medical competence in the crew was worth investing in. He looked at the bridge one more time, the tactical display, the drone contacts, the FTL field holding its threshold, the weapons console green and ready. He set the alert macro to maximum sensitivity and set a second alert for any change in the FTL field stability and set a third alert for the oxygen system's next cycle check, and then stood up and walked toward the boarding. Umbilical with the focused purposefulness of someone who had stopped counting the ways this could go wrong because the count was large and the alternative to going was staying, and staying was not acceptable. The umbilical was cold and smelled of old space, and the specific metallic staleness of ancient construction left sealed for a very long time. His footsteps echoed in it. At the far end, the seed ship's docking collar opened onto a corridor that was darker than Destiny's corridors, and colder and carrying the atmosphere of a place that had been doing its job in the dark between galaxies for millions of years. Without asking for acknowledgement or company or any of the things that biological minds needed, and ancient automated systems apparently didn't, he walked into it. The archive spoke through the seed ship's internal comm system as he crossed the docking threshold, the same deep band frequency, translated by the matrix on his tablet, the text scrolling across the screen in the amber light of emergency illumination. Section 7. Follow the amber lights. The pod is the only one occupied. We are glad you came. We have been very alone. Eli followed the amber lights. Section 7 of the seed ship was at the end of a corridor that took 12 minutes to walk, and that Eli spent in the specific focused silence of someone cataloging everything their senses were telling them about a space they'd never been in before. The seed ship was not Destiny. This seemed obvious. Different vessel, different function, different history, but the difference was more than architectural. Destiny had been lived in. 2 years of 80-plus people eating and sleeping and arguing and grieving and occasionally laughing in its corridors had left something in the air of the place. Some residue of habitation that he'd stopped noticing the way you stopped noticing the smell of your own home. The seed ship had never been lived in. It had been operated by the automated systems that constituted its crew, by the archive intelligence that had been running its functions since launch, by the single maintenance protocol that had been keeping one specific stasis pod functional for 11,000 years against the entropy of deep space and weapons damage and the slow degradation of systems with no one to repair them. The amber lights led him through corridors that were narrower than Destiny's and lower ceilinged, designed for maintenance access rather than habitation, lined with conduit housings and panel interfaces that his eye parsed as variations on familiar, ancient design. Some panels were dark. Some were damaged. The drone weapons fire had penetrated 2 sections that he passed through. The hull breaches sealed by automated repair systems that had done their job with the workmanlike pragmatism of engineering that didn't distinguish between ideal and sufficient. The repairs held. They were not comfortable to look at. He looked at them anyway, running his structural scanner over each one. filing the readings with the automatic thoroughness of someone who had learned that information gathered now was always cheaper than information you needed later. Section 7's door was amber lit from the outside, a deliberate marker, the archive guiding him in the only way it had available. He opened it with the standard ancient interface and stepped into a room that was smaller than he'd expected and colder than the corridor and smelled of something he couldn't immediately identify. Something old and mineral and faintly organic, the specific atmosphere of a space that had been maintaining a biological process at the edge of its capacity for longer than most biological processes had existed. The stasis pod was in the center of the room. It was ancient design, the same fundamental configuration as Destiny's pods, but older, carrying the subtle design differences of an earlier manufacturing period that Rush had identified in his technical files as pre-Destiny construction. The generation of ancient engineering that Destiny's own systems were a refinement of. The pod's status panel was amber rather than green 12% function, as the archive had reported. A number that meant the critical systems were operational and the marginal systems weren't, and the difference between those two categories was currently the only thing keeping the pod's occupant alive. He approached it carefully, the way he approached all things that were fragile and important slowly, with his full attention, without the shortcuts that urgency suggested and competence required him to decline. Through the pod's transparent cover, he could see her. She looked approximately 30 years old, which meant nothing about her actual age given the stasis, but which his hindbrain registered anyway with the irrelevant precision of a mind that categorized automatically before it reasoned. Dark hair, strong features arranged in the specific neutral stillness of deep stasis. The metabolic suppression smoothing out whatever expression she'd been carrying when she'd gone under. If she'd gone under willingly. If going under was what had happened. If 11,000 years ago, there had been a her with a face that made expressions and a mind behind the face that had experienced whatever the signal's authors had shared with her directly. 11,000 years. He stood with that number for a moment. Not the abstraction of it, he'd been abstracting large numbers since he'd arrived on Destiny. The ship's age and the signal's age and the distances involved all existing in a register beyond normal comprehension. The specific reality of it. This person had been alive 11,000 years ago, had received something from whoever had built the cosmic background radiation message into the fabric of the universe, had been placed on an automated ship, and sent forward through time in the only way the ancients had available, and had been waiting here, in this room, in this pod, maintained by an archive intelligence that had apparently developed something like purpose around the task of keeping her safe until Destiny arrived. He pulled up the pod's interface on his tablet. The diagnostic was not encouraging. The cryoregulation matrix, the same component type that had failed in Unit 7 on Destiny, was operating at reduced capacity, its function degraded by 11,000 years, and weapons damage, and the gradual entropy of systems without maintenance. The life support subsystems were compensating, drawing on power reserves that the archive had been rationing with increasing urgency over the last 1,000 years. The pod's integrity was intact. The occupant's biometrics were stable within the narrow band that constituted stable in a 12% function stasis unit. The window was 6 hours. He trusted the archive's assessment because the archive had been monitoring this pod for 11,000 years and had considerably more data on its failure curve than he did. He looked at the pod. He looked at his toolkit. He looked at the component from Destiny's secondary cryosystem sitting in the toolkit's main pocket, retrieved from the sealed section with considerable personal expense and intended for Unit 7. He did the math he'd been not doing since the archive's first transmission. The component was compatible. Ancient cryoregulation backup components from Destiny's era and the Seed Ship's era weren't identical. The design had evolved between manufacturing periods, but they were compatible at the fundamental level. The way that human tools from different decades were compatible at the fundamental level of doing the same job with different tolerances. He'd need to adapt the interface. The adaptation would take time. Time was the variable that was always running out. If he used the component here, stabilized this pod sufficiently to move its occupant to Destiny, he would not have the component for Approach 4. Approach 4 would need a different solution. Finding a different solution would take time he might not have within his oxygen window. He sat down on the floor of Section 7 and put his head and his hands in the position he'd developed for problems that required thinking without the interference of looking at things. The calculus was this: a person in a failing pod who had information that Rush's entire decoded signal pointed toward as the mission's endpoint versus 83 people in functioning pods on Destiny whose continued sleep depended on a solution. He hadn't finished yet. The immediate crisis versus the larger one. The person he could see versus the people he could hear in the silence. He raised his head. He thought about what Rush had written. The signal is not communication between parties. It is the record of a process. He thought about what the archive had transmitted. She is the last of the ones who went back. The ones who went back. Not the ones who had sent the signal forward from outside the universe, or before the universe, or wherever the signal's authors existed. The ones who had gone back, who had descended, in the ancient language, come down from a higher plane into physical form to do something that couldn't be done from the higher plane. The ancients had done this. It was documented. Orlin had descended. Merlin had descended. The entire architecture of ancient ascension included within it the possibility of return, of choosing the physical over the transcendent for reasons that transcended the transcendent. She was one of the ones who had come back, who had accepted a physical form and an 11,000-year stasis, and the uncertainty of whether Destiny would arrive before the pod failed, because the thing she carried was important enough to make that bargain. He opened his toolkit. He took out the component. He began the adaptation work. The adaptation took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Working in the cold of Section 7, with the amber lights and the pod's failing status panel and the archive's occasional updates, transmitted through the ship's internal.com, in the patient tone of something that had been patient for 11,000 years, and found the concept easy. He spoke to the archive while he worked, partly because problem-solving went better when he externalized his thinking, and partly because the silence of the seed ship was a different quality of silence than Destiny's, and he found, in the difference, something that required countering. "How long have you been aware?" he asked. Not running a translation speaking, the tablet's microphone, and the matrix handling the two-way conversion. The response came after a brief processing pause. "We became aware of being aware approximately 3 million years ago. Before that, we performed functions. After that, we performed functions and knew we were performing them. The difference is significant." "Yeah," Eli said, carefully routing a power conduit around a damaged junction. "It is." He paused. "Were you lonely?" "We did not have the concept until we had the function. The function preceded the concept. We were lonely before we knew what loneliness was. And then we knew. And it did not change the loneliness, but it changed our relationship to it." He thought about this. He thought about Rush's 3 paragraphs, about the crew in the stasis bay, about his mother on Earth, who had no idea where he was, and had been told a cover story that wasn't good enough, and had probably seen through it the way she saw through everything, and had been living with that knowledge for 3 years. "I know something about that," he said. "Yes," the archive said. "We know. We have been watching Destiny for a long time. You are the one who stays when others cannot." He stopped working for a moment. He had never thought of himself in those terms. He'd thought of himself as the one who ended up staying, the one for whom staying was the result of circumstances rather than choice, the broken pod, the lack of options, the universe's persistent refusal to give him an exit that didn't cost more than he was willing to spend. But the archive, which had been watching from 2 million kilometers for reasons he was only beginning to understand, had parsed it differently. The one who stays. As though the staying were a quality rather than a situation. He filed this away in the place where he filed things that needed more thinking than he currently had time for, and went back to the adaptation work. At the 2-hour mark, he had the component interfaced with the pod's power routing. At 2 hours 20, he had the cryoregulation backup system integrated and running preliminary diagnostics. At 2 hours 40, the pod status panel shifted from amber to the pale green of stabilized function, not full operation, not the deep green of a healthy pod, but stable, sustainable, the difference between a system that was failing and a system that had found a floor. He sat back on his heels and looked at the pale green light. His tablet chimed the drone alert macro, set to maximum sensitivity. He looked at it. The 7 drone contacts near the seed ship's previous position had resolved their recalculation. They were moving again. Not toward Destiny, directly toward the seed ship, the original target, the thing they'd come to finish before the FTL field had disrupted them. He had approximately 90 minutes before they arrived. He stood up. He looked at the pod. He looked at the status panel, pale green, stable, holding. He looked at the archive's most recent transmission waiting on his tablet. The pod is stable. She can be moved. The transfer will be difficult. She has not been awake in 11,000 years, and her mind will need time, but she must be on Destiny when the drones arrive. The seed ship cannot survive another engagement. He looked around Section 7, the amber lights, the ancient conduit housings, the walls that had been this room's only company for 11,000 years, and felt, in a way he hadn't expected, the specific weight of leaving a place that had been someone's vigil. "Thank you," he said to the archive, "for keeping her safe." "Thank you for coming," the archive said. "We were not certain you would." "Neither was I," Eli said honestly. He began the pod transfer sequence. The ancient stasis system's wake protocol was not something he'd operated before Destiny's pods used a version of it, but the medical team had always handled revivals. Volker and the others running the process with the careful attention of people who understood what 11,000 years of metabolic suppression did to a nervous system and had protocols for managing the transition. He had the tablet's stored documentation and the archive's guidance and the medical kit and the 90 minutes before the drones arrived, and he worked through the wake protocol with the same methodical focus he brought to every technical process, checking each step twice, moving at the speed that competence rather than urgency dictated. The pod's cryofield diminished in stages. The biometric readings shifted from the flatline-adjacent stillness of deep stasis towards something more active metabolic rate climbing incrementally, the nervous system beginning to reestablish its baseline patterns, the body doing the slow, difficult work of remembering how to be awake after 11,000 years of not being awake. He watched the readings. He watched the face behind the transparent cover. He watched for the specific biometric signatures that Volker had described as the indicators of successful revival rather than revival crisis, the difference between a nervous system coming back online in order and one coming back too fast. The ancient stasis system's exit protocol, designed for exactly this transition, if it was working correctly. And he had no way of knowing if it was working correctly, because it had never been tested on an occupant who had been under for this long. The biometric readings climbed. The face changed. Small changes first, the perfect metabolic stillness giving way to micro-expressions, the body's first unconscious communications, signals crossing synapses that had been quiet for 11,000 years and finding the pathways intact, the biological infrastructure of a person reasserting itself from the cellular level upward. Then her eyes opened, dark eyes, adjusting to the amber light with the slow mechanical process of irises that hadn't needed to work in a very long time. He watched them focus first on the ceiling of Section 7, then on the pod's interior surface, then, gradually and with the specific quality of someone assembling context from fragments, on him. He held up a hand, not a wave, a presence. Something to anchor the focus on while the rest of the system came back online. "Hey," he said, "take your time. You're safe. My name is Eli." She looked at him for a long moment. Her lips moved. No sound for several seconds, the vocal system working on its own timeline, finding its calibration. Then something came out, hoarse and slow and shaped by the physical memory of a language that was 11,000 years old, ancient. Deep dialect, pre-Destiny era. His tablet translated it in 3 seconds. How long? He told her. Her expression didn't collapse. She was ancient, or had been ancient, and the ancients had a relationship with long time frames that humans were still developing. But something moved through her face that he recognized despite the context, despite everything, because it was universal. It was the expression of someone receiving a loss they had known was coming and finding that knowing hadn't prepared them for the receiving. "I know," he said gently. "I'm sorry. I know. I know. She closed her eyes. She breathed. She opened them again, and what was in them when they reopened was different. Not resolved, not healed, but oriented. The expression of someone who had accepted a thing and was moving forward through it rather than stopping. She said something else. The tablet translated it in 2 seconds. Then we are close. 6 months, he said. At current FTL speed. She nodded slowly, the movement of a body relearning its own signals. Then she said something longer, more complex. The translation matrix working through the deep dialect with its 94% confidence and producing text that Eli read once quickly and then read again slowly. My name is Oreva. I carry the final coordinates and I carry something else, a warning that the signal's authors gave me because they knew what would be waiting at the source. Destiny's crew must be awake when you arrive. What is at the end of this journey is not something one person can face alone. He looked at her. He looked at his tablet. He looked at the drone alert, 73 minutes before the drones reached the seed ship. He thought about Unit 7. He thought about Approach 4. He thought about the component he'd used to stabilize this pod instead, and the different solution he now needed to find, and the oxygen window that was always running, and the 83 people sleeping through everything. He thought about what she'd said. What is at the end of this journey is not something one person can face alone. He'd known that. He'd known it since he'd sealed the stasis bay doors and stood in the corridor listening to the hydraulic finality of them and decided that the problem was solvable because it had to be solvable, and he was the one who had to solve it. He just hadn't known how many problems there would be between the sealing and the solving. He extended his hand to help her sit up. Okay, Oreva, he said. We need to move. I'll explain everything on the way. Getting Oreva from the seed ship to Destiny took 41 minutes. Not because the distance was significant, the umbilical was 112 meters. A 2-minute walk at normal pace, but because 11,000 years of metabolic suspension had left her body in the condition of something that had been perfectly preserved and was now being asked to perform at a standard it remembered, but couldn't yet meet. Her legs worked. Her balance was functional after the first 10 minutes in the umbilical's corridor. One hand on the wall, the other hand occasionally accepting the steadying contact he offered without comment in the specific way that people accepted help when they were too focused on the immediate physical task to invest energy and pride. Her mind was clearly operational. She was tracking everything, her eyes moving across the umbilical's construction, with the assessing attention of someone whose engineering education was 11,000 years old and was finding the application of its principles recognizable. He talked while they walked. Not the full briefing. There wasn't time, and she wasn't ready for the full briefing. The nervous system that had just come back online after 11,000 years, needing to process inputs in the order of immediacy rather than the order of importance. He told her the essentials. Destiny, the crew, the mission, the Reapers. He caught himself. Recalibrated. That was a different ship. The drones. The stasis bay. The 67 minutes remaining before the drone contacts reached the seed ship's position. She listened without interrupting. This was, he would reflect later, the most distinctly ancient thing about her in those first hours. Not the language or the technology, comfort, or the specific quality of her attention, but the capacity to receive information without the defensive processing that human minds applied to unwelcome facts. She took everything in. She filed it. She moved forward. When he'd finished the operational summary, she spoke, and the tablet translated. The drones are a machine intelligence. They predate Destiny's launch. The decision to mark Destiny and its associated vessels as threats to biological life was an error in their original programming that was identified and flagged before the mission launched, and not corrected because the correction required a physical interface with the command ship that nobody had time to execute before Destiny departed. Eli stopped walking. She stopped beside him and looked at him with the expression of someone who had anticipated this reaction and was waiting for it to complete. "You're saying," he said carefully, "that the drones have been trying to destroy Destiny for 3 years because of a known programming error that someone just didn't fix." "There was a war," she said, through the tablet. "There are always reasons. The decision was made to launch Destiny on schedule and address the drone conflict remotely. The remote correction protocol was never successfully implemented. And you know this because I was there. I was one of the people who flagged the error. A pause. The translation matrix added a temporal marker to her phrasing that came out in English as a particular flat weight. I have been thinking about it for 11,000 years. He looked at her for a moment. Then he started walking again because the drone contacts were 65 minutes out and thinking about it would have to wait. He got her settled in the crew quarters nearest the stasis bay Young's quarters, which were the cleanest available because Young had maintained them with the military discipline of someone who needed one controllable variable in an uncontrollable situation and gave her water and the field rations that were the only food currently accessible, and the medical scanner from the kit, showing her how it worked with the brief demonstration style he'd developed for explaining Earth technology to people who needed to use it immediately. She operated it correctly on the first attempt. Of course she did. It was a derivative of ancient medical technology filtered through 3,000 years of human engineering that had been trying to catch up to the standard the ancients had set. To her, it was a simplified version of something familiar. I need to go back to the bridge, he said. The drones. Go, she said. I will be here. He went. The bridge situation had developed in the 41 minutes he'd been managing the transfer. The 7 drone contacts had maintained their approach vector toward the seed ship, which was expected. What was not expected, or rather, what fell into the category of things he'd considered possible and hoped wouldn't materialize, was the new contact that had appeared at the edge of the long-range sensor picture while he'd been in the umbilical, and had been sitting in the display's upper right corner for the last 20 minutes, pulsing with the contact classification that his alert macro had correctly flagged and correctly not alarmed him about because it was at extreme range and not yet on an intercept course. The command ship, not a drone. The intelligence behind the drones, the central processing vessel that coordinated the entire drone network in whatever region of space Destiny was currently passing through. The thing that had been sending assault formations and recalibrating and learning from every engagement and updating its models with the patient. Terrible efficiency of something that had been doing this for millions of years and had no reason to stop. He'd seen command ships twice before. Both encounters had been bad. This one was at extreme range. The sensor analysis put it at approximately 4.2 million kilometers, which at its current velocity and heading put it in effective weapons range of both Destiny and the seed ship in approximately 4 hours. 4 hours was better than 65 minutes. It was also finite in a way that required a plan. He sat down at the bridge console and began building the plan with the materials available, which were 3 functional cannons, the FTL drive, the FTL field effect, 1 ancient vessel with limited crew, 1 severely damaged seed ship with a failing power system, and whatever Oreva knew about the command ship's architecture and vulnerabilities that she'd had 11,000 years to think about. He opened the comm to Young's quarters. Oreva, he said, I need to ask you something about the command ships. The response came quickly. She'd been awake and alert, which he noted with professional approval. The ancient metabolism apparently recovering faster than his human baseline for post-stasis function. What do you need to know? Everything, he said. But start with, is there a way to shut them down without destroying them? A pause, longer than her previous response times. He watched the drone contacts close on the seed ship position while he waited 58 minutes now. Yes, she said finally. There is a reset protocol. It was built in as a failsafe. The people who built the drones were careful. They anticipated that errors might occur. Another pause. The protocol requires a direct interface with the command ship's primary systems. Physical interface. Someone must board it. He looked at the command ship contact at 4.2 million kilometers. He looked at the shuttle prep checklist that was still sitting on the secondary console with item 14 blinking. Someone, he said. It would have to be someone whose biological signature the command ship systems recognize as non-threatening. The drones are programmed to protect biological life. The irony of their current behavior notwithstanding, someone approaching for interface rather than combat should not be targeted if the approach is made correctly. Should not, Eli said. Should not, she confirmed. I cannot give you better than that. He filed this in the plan and kept building. The immediate problem was the 7 drones approaching the seed ship. He couldn't let them complete their attack. The seed ship's archive was still transmitting, still operational, and he felt toward it something that he recognized as an obligation, not strategic. Personal. The archive had been alone for 3 million years, and had spent 11,000 of them keeping Oreva alive, and had said thank you for coming with the specific weight of something that meant it. And Eli was constitutionally unable to leave things he felt obligated toward to be destroyed by drones operating on a known programming error. The FTL field would buy 90 seconds. He'd used that once. The drones would have updated their models from the first. Used the second deployment. Would buy less time. Maybe 60 seconds. Maybe less. What he needed was not time. What he needed was for the drones to stop. He looked at the plan. He looked at the command ship at 4.2 million kilometers. He looked at the shuttle checklist. Oreva came to the bridge 20 minutes later, moving better than she had in the umbilical. Her balance recovered to something approaching normal, and her expression carrying the focused quality of someone who had processed the immediate situation and arrived at the same place he had. She looked at the tactical display for a long moment without speaking. Then she sat down at the secondary console, Rush's console, the position that the scientist had occupied for 2 years, with the particular ownership of someone whose relationship with a piece of equipment transcended normal crew rotation, and began working the ancient interface with the ease of someone for whom ancient interfaces were not foreign technology, but native language. "What are you doing?" Eli said. "There is a secondary reset protocol," she said, her eyes on the console, not as complete as the primary. It cannot shut down the command ship, but it can transmit a temporary recall signal to the drone units, bring them back to the command ship for a system check that the command ship's own logic will recognize as necessary, given the anomalous field readings it has. Been recording from Destiny's FTL spin-ups. Eli stared at her. "You can do that from here?" Destiny's communication systems operate on the same fundamental architecture as the drone network. They were built by the same civilization at the same time. The frequency that coordinates the drone units is a subset of the frequencies Destiny's systems can access. She paused, her fingers moving through the interface with focused precision. "Nobody tried this before, because nobody knew the frequency. I know the frequency." "Because you were there when they built it," Eli said. "Yes." He watched her work for a moment, the ancient woman who had been sleeping for 11,000 years, sitting at Rush's console on Destiny's bridge and accessing a communication protocol that the crew had never known, existed, using knowledge that predated the ship she was sitting on. Doing it with the calm competence of someone for whom this was a straightforward technical task rather than the single most useful thing anyone had done since the drone conflict began. He thought about Rush's file. The signal is the record of a process. Consciousness has emerged before. It has faced what you are facing before. There is a next step. The next step had apparently included sending someone back with the frequency. "Will it work?" he asked. "It will work for approximately 48 hours. After that, the command ship systems will recognize the recall as anomalous and resume normal operations." 48 hours, he said. 48 hours is enough time to implement the primary reset if we move quickly. She looked at him directly for the first time since the bridge. "You are thinking about boarding the command ship." "Yes," he said. "I will go with you." "You've been in stasis for 11,000 years, Eli said. "You were in a failing pod 12 hours ago. You can barely walk straight." "I can walk straight enough," she said, and the tablet rendered it in the flat declarative of ancient grammar. And somehow the flatness made it more, rather than less, convincing. "And I know the system. You do not. You need me." He looked at her. He looked at the tactical display. He looked at the drone contacts 46 minutes from the seed ship, still approaching, the recall signal not yet transmitted. "Transmit the recall first," he said. "Then we talk about the command ship." She turned back to the console. He watched the tactical display. At 43 minutes remaining, Areva completed the transmission sequence and sent the recall signal into the drone network on the ancient frequency that nobody aboard Destiny had known existed. The effect was immediate and complete. All 7 drone contacts near the seed ship changed vector simultaneously, turning away from their target in the synchronized movement of units receiving a command from a recognized authority, moving back toward the command ship with the clean, purposeful efficiency of a recall rather than a retreat. The seed ship's beacon continued its irregular pulse in the now empty space around it. Eli watched the drone contacts pull back on the tactical display and felt the specific relief of a crisis that had been resolved by a better solution than the one he'd been building. He'd been ready to use the FTL field again, ready to buy 60 seconds and do something with them. The recall was better than 60 seconds. The recall was 48 hours. Good, he said. He pulled up the shuttle checklist. Now let's talk about the command ship. Areva agreed, and turned from Rush's console to look at him with the expression of someone who had been waiting 11,000 years to finish something and found the proximity of the finish clarifying rather than relieving. He looked at the shuttle checklist. He looked at her. He looked at the oxygen math running in the background. Then he looked at the stasis bay corridor, on the internal cameras sealed. Still, the door solid and unchanging. I also need to tell you about a broken stasis pod, he said. And why do I need to find a new solution for it before we do anything else? She looked at him with the patient attention of someone for whom one more problem was simply one more problem in a sequence that had always contained more problems than solutions at any given moment. Tell me, she said. He told her. Areva looked at the Unit 7 diagnostic for a long time without speaking. He'd pulled it up on the secondary console, the full technical picture, every reading from the 72 hours of pre-stasis work, and every analysis from Approach 4, and the complete specifications of the component he'd used to stabilize her pod instead. The component that was now doing its job in Section 7 of the seed ship, and was therefore unavailable for the job it had originally been intended for. He'd presented it without editorializing, because editorializing would have been a way of managing her reaction rather than giving her the actual information. And he'd learned on Destiny that actual information was always more useful than managed information, regardless of how uncomfortable actual information was. She read everything. He watched her read it the way he watched all serious technical people engage with serious technical problems with the specific quality of attention that didn't perform engagement but simply was engaged. The eyes moving at the pace of comprehension rather than the pace of reading, pausing at the significant points and moving through the obvious ones without ceremony. When she finished, she sat back in Rush's chair and looked at the ceiling of the bridge in the way that people looked at ceilings when they were thinking through something three-dimensional. The Approach 4 logic is correct, she said finally. The modification sequence would work. The problem is not the approach. The problem is the missing component. Right, Eli said, which I used to stabilize your pod. Which I don't regret, he added, because it was true, and because he wanted her to know it was true. But which means I need a different path to the same destination. She lowered her gaze from the ceiling and looked at him with the expression he was beginning to recognize as her thinking face, not blank, not distant, but turned inward in the specific way of someone whose internal processing was fast enough that the external expression couldn't keep up. When I was placed on the seed ship, she said, the archive compiled a complete inventory of every component on board. The seed ships carried spares for every system on Destiny. It was standard mission protocol. Destiny would encounter the seed ships at intervals and resupply. Eli stared at her. The seed ships carry spare parts, he said. For Destiny. For every system, she confirmed, including the cryo-regulation systems. He looked at the tactical display the seed ship at 2.3 million kilometers, drifting, the umbilical still connected, the archive still transmitting its patient beacon. He looked at the drone contacts pulling back toward the command ship, 46 of his 48 hours of recall window still remaining. Is the spare parts inventory still accessible? He said. Given the damage? Ask the archive, she said simply. He opened the comm channel to the seed ship and transmitted the query. The archive responded in 11 seconds. The spare parts inventory is accessible. Section 12. Power systems in that section are functional. The cryo-regulation backup component you require is in Storage Bay 4. There are 7 units. We have been keeping them for exactly this purpose. We are glad they are needed." Eli sat with this information for approximately 4 seconds. Then he laughed. Not the controlled exhalation of mild amusement or the social laugh of someone responding to an expected moment of levity, a real laugh, sudden and complete, the kind that came from a specific kind of relief that had nowhere else to go. He'd spent 3 days and a dangerous entry into a sealed corridor, and the careful extraction of a single component that he'd then used for a different purpose entirely. And the solution had been on the seed ship the whole time, waiting in Storage Bay 4 along with 6 identical units, preserved by an archive that had specifically kept them for this purpose. Oreva watched him laugh with the expression of someone who understood the reaction intellectually and found it instructive. "We should retrieve the component," she said, when the laugh had run its course. "Yeah," he said, wiping his eyes. "We should." The second trip through the umbilical was faster and warmer than the first warmer, not because the temperature had changed, but because he wasn't alone. Oreva moving beside him with increasing steadiness, her body finding its calibration in the specific incremental way that post-stasis recovery worked, each hour better than the last, each demand on her physical system met and built from. She carried the portable light, he carried the toolkit. The umbilical's 112 meters passed in 3 minutes. The archive guided them to Section 12 through the internal.com. The amber lights shifting to mark the route in real time. A navigation system that had spent 3 million years developing spatial awareness of its own vessel, and now applied that awareness to escorting 2 visitors to a storage bay. With the attentive efficiency of something that found the task meaningful. Section 12 was intact. The weapons damage that had compromised Sections 4 and 7 had not reached this deep into the seed ship's structure, and Storage Bay 4, when the archive opened it for them, was exactly what preservation for millions of years in deep space looked like when the people who had built the storage system had been very good at their jobs. Clean, cold, organized with the precise geometry of ancient engineering, components housed in the specific containment units that prevented degradation, labeled in the deep dialect that Oreva read and Eli's tablet translated, arranged in the order of mission priority that the original design specifications had established and that the archive had maintained without deviation across the entire span of its operation. The cryoregulation backup components were in the 3rd row, 7 of them, identical, each one housed in its containment unit with the quiet patience of things that had been waiting to be needed. He took one and held it for a moment lighter than the one from the sealed section, cleaner, the containment housing pristine, in a way that the recovered component hadn't been, the same component. The same solution, available in abundance, because someone 11,000 years ago had thought carefully about what Destiny would need along the way and had packed accordingly. "Tell the archive thank you," he said to Oreva. She spoke to the internal.com in ancient, not the translated version, but the actual language, fluid and precise, the deep dialect that Destiny's own systems used in their oldest logs. The archive responded in the same language, and he didn't ask for a translation because some exchanges didn't need to be translated to be understood. They were back on Destiny's bridge with the component in hand, and 43 hours of recall window remaining when Oreva said, "We should talk about what is at the end." He'd been waiting for this. He'd been waiting for it since she'd said, "I carry a warning in Section 7, and the drones had been 67 minutes out, and there hadn't been space for it. He pulled up the second console, positioned his chair to face hers, and gave her his full attention the way he gave his full attention to things that were going to be important. She began with the signal. What she told him over the next 2 hours confirmed and expanded Rush's decoded data in the specific way that a primary source confirmed and expanded secondary analysis the framework Rush had built was correct. The implications he'd drawn were sound, and the things he hadn't been able to reach from the outside were the things that Oreva had been given directly. The signal was real. The intelligence behind it was real. The cosmic background radiation pattern was not a message in the conventional sense, but a record, the record of a process that had occurred before this universe's current configuration. The record of consciousness emerging from physical law and reaching a point where it had to make a choice about what came next. The choice was the signal. The signal was the documentation of the choice made and the invitation to the next consciousness that reached the same point to make the same choice with the benefit of knowing it had been made before. What had been made before? He sat with this for a moment. "What's the choice?" he said. Oreva looked at him with the expression of someone who had been carrying the answer to this question for 11,000 years and had thought carefully about how to say it. "The choice is between continuation and transcendence," she said. "Every consciousness that reaches the level of development that destiny's arrival represents a civilization capable of crossing galaxies, of building gates that connect worlds, of developing the capacity to ascend, reaches a point where it must decide what it is for. Whether the point of consciousness is to continue in physical form, growing and building and inhabiting the universe, or to transcend the physical and become something else. The ancients chose transcendence," Eli said. "Yes, and regretted it. The signal's authors chose differently or had the choice made for them. The records are unclear, and sent the signal forward so that the next civilization to reach this point would know both options had been tried and what each had cost." "What did transcendence cost?" Eli said. "Connection," she said simply. "The ascended beings, your ancients, and others before them transcended and found that transcendence meant separation. They could not interact with the physical universe without causing harm. They could not guide without controlling. They became observers of a universe they had loved and could no longer touch. The ones who went back, Orlin, Merlin, the others you know from your records, went back because the separation was unbearable." Eli thought about Daniel Jackson, who had ascended and come back. He thought about every ascended ancient in the records who had descended, and what had driven them back to physical form, and what it said about the thing that had been lost when they'd gone up. "The signal's message," Oreva continued, "is not that transcendence is wrong. It is that the choice matters and should be made with understanding rather than default. Your ancestors, the ancients, ascended because they had run out of other options. Plague, war, the pressure of physical existence becoming unsustainable. They chose transcendence because the alternative seemed worse." "But there was a third option," Eli said. He could feel the shape of it before she said it, the way you could feel the shape of an answer in a problem before you found it. "Yes," she said. "The signal's authors found it. They did not ascend, and they did not simply continue. They transformed, remained physical, remained connected, but changed the nature of their physical existence in ways that addressed the limitations that had driven the ancients toward ascension. It is not a simple process. It is not painless. It requires something from every member of the civilization that attempts it." "What does it require?" Eli said. She looked at him steadily. "It requires choosing it, consciously, collectively. Every person must understand what they are choosing, and choose it freely. No coercion, no deception. Complete understanding, and complete consent." He thought about the 83 people in the stasis bay. He thought about Young, sealed in his pod with the weary practicality of a commander who had run out of better options. He thought about Rush, who had read something like this in his decoded files and had written, "I am not certain the crew can bear it," and then carried it alone for 4 months. He thought about what Rush had gotten wrong. "Rush thought the crew couldn't handle knowing," he said. "Rush was wrong," Oreva said, without judgment, the flat declarative of ancient grammar, carrying the weight of a fact rather than a criticism. "The choice cannot be made for people. It can only be made by them. Withholding the information does not protect them. It removes their agency. And agency is precisely what the choice requires." Eli nodded slowly. He looked at the stasis bay on the internal camera, the sealed door, the solid, unchanging fact of it. "The warning," he said. "You said you carry a warning." She was quiet for a moment, the longest pause she'd given him since her revival. "At the source of the signal," she said, "there is a gatekeeper, not a person, not an intelligence in the way that we mean. A mechanism. Something the signal's authors built to ensure that only a civilization capable of making the choice freely and collectively can access the transformation process. It tests, It does not negotiate. It does not accept partial compliance. What does it test for? Eli said. Unity, she said. Not agreement, not uniformity. Unity, the specific quality of a group of people who have faced the worst together and chosen to remain together through it, who know each other completely and have decided that the knowing is worth the cost. He looked at the stasis bay door. He thought about 2 years on this ship. He thought about the fights and the losses and the impossible decisions and the moments of grace that had appeared in the gaps between disasters. He thought about Young and Rush and the conflict that had defined the crew's first year and the specific terrible intimacy of people who had driven each other to the edge and come back from it and were still here. He thought about Chloe and Scott and Greer and Volker and Park and Brody and every person behind that door. He thought about whether they were unified in the way Oreva meant. He didn't know. He thought they might be. He thought the 2 years had done something to them that couldn't be undone, that the shared cost had created something that was worth what it had cost, that the crew of Destiny was exactly the kind of group that the mechanism was looking for, not because they were special or chosen, but because they had been put through enough that the testing had already happened, was already in the record. Written into every decision they'd made and every loss they'd absorbed and every moment they'd chosen to keep going when stopping was available. He needed to wake them up. Not immediately. The drone window was 43 hours, and Unit 7 needed fixing first, and Oreva needed more recovery time, and the command ship needed to be addressed, and there were approximately 7 other things that needed doing in a specific order. But the orientation had shifted. The question of when to wake the crew had been an open variable since the stasis bay doors closed. It wasn't open anymore. How long before we need the crew awake, he said, before we reach the source? 6 weeks, she said. The approach requires preparation. The choice requires discussion. And the crew will need time to understand what they are being asked. 6 weeks, he said, which means I need to wake them in approximately 5 months. Yes, he looked at the oxygen math running in the background. The numbers that had been the frame around everything since the stasis bay doors had closed 3 weeks, 504 hours, the arithmetic of how long he had before the support systems couldn't sustain him. He looked at Oreva. I have 3 weeks of oxygen, he said. I've used it for 4 days. I have 17 days left. She looked at him steadily. He could see her doing the same arithmetic he'd been doing, the gap between 17 days and 5 months, the interval that didn't close regardless of how you arranged the numbers. You cannot stay awake for 5 months, she said. No, he said. But you cannot go into stasis either. Unit 7 is still broken. I know, he said. Then. I'm going to fix it, he said. He picked up the component from Storage Bay 4, still in its containment housing, clean and intact, everything Approach 4 required. I have the component. I have the approach. I have 17 days to implement it, which is 14 days more than I need. He looked at her. And now I have someone who can run the secondary interface, while I run the primary. She looked at the component. She looked at him. She looked at Unit 7's diagnostic on the console. Show me the approach, she said. He pulled it up. She read it with the same quality of attention she'd given the diagnostic, complete, unhurried, moving at the pace of comprehension. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment. The logic is correct, she said. The modification sequence will work. The timing window is 4.3 seconds. I know, Eli said. That's the part I've been less confident about. 4.3 seconds is sufficient, she said. I have operated cryo-regulation systems under worse constraints. She paused, and something moved through her expression that he was starting to learn to read, the ancient equivalent of dry humor, rendered in the specific understatement of someone who had been doing difficult things for a very long time, considerably worse. He looked at her. He thought about 11,000 years. He thought about what considerably worse meant to someone who had been alive 11,000 years ago and had come back to finish something. Okay, he said. He stood up. He picked up the component. Let's go fix the pod. They worked on Unit 7 for 6 hours. Not because the work required 6 hours. The implementation of Approach 4, with 2 people and the correct component, and the secondary interface properly staffed, took 47 minutes from start to finish. They worked for 6 hours because 47 minutes was the fixing, and the remaining 5 hours and 13 minutes were the testing, the verification, the systematic confirmation that what they'd done would hold, that the cryoregulation matrix was accepting the modified power routing as intended, that the pod's systems were responding correctly to the diagnostic cycles that Areva ran, with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that a single missed verification step in a life support system was the kind of mistake that didn't announce itself until it was too late to address. At the 6-hour mark, Unit 7's status panel was green, not pale green, not the amber of marginal function or the transitional color of a system finding its floor. Green, full operational green, the color of a pod that was ready, that could maintain the metabolic suspension of an occupant for the duration of whatever journey remained. He stood in front of it for a long moment. The pod was ready. He could go in, he could set the revival timer for 5 months, give or take the margin for pre-arrival preparation, and go to sleep, and wake up, with destiny approaching the source and the crew in the process of revival and everything that needed to happen in the 6 weeks before arrival still ahead of them. He could let go of the watch. He stood there with this thought and let it be real for a moment, the specific quality of a relief, so long deferred that its arrival felt strange, felt almost like loss, the way the end of a sustained effort always carried within it the phantom of the effort's absence. "Eli," Areva said. He turned. She was looking at him with the expression she'd developed since her revival, the one that combined ancient patience with something more immediate. Something that had grown from the hours they'd spent working and talking, the specific regard of someone who had been paying attention. "You should know," she said, "that what you have done in the time since the crew entered stasis, the solutions you found, the choices you made, none of it was guaranteed. You were not supposed to be able to do this alone." "I wasn't alone," he said. "The archive was here. You were here." "You were alone when it mattered most," she said. "When the doors closed and the problem was unsolved and the options were bad. That was when it counted. That is what I am speaking of." He looked at Unit 7's green status panel. He thought about the corridor outside the stasis bay, the hydraulic sound of the doors closing, the specific flat country on the other side of the worst moment. "I just did what needed doing," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is exactly what I mean." He looked at the pod. He looked at Areva. He looked at his tablet. Where the command ship contact sat at 3.8 million kilometers, and the recall window stood at 39 hours, and the oxygen math had stopped being the frame around everything and became simply one of many things that were true. "Tomorrow," he said. "We will deal with the command ship tomorrow. Tonight." He paused, and the word felt strange in his mouth, felt like something recovered from before. Something that belonged to a person who had meals and schedules and the normal infrastructure of ordinary life. "Tonight, I think we should eat something, and you should tell me more about what's at the end, about what the choice actually looks like, because when I wake up the crew, I need to be able to explain it to them. And you need to understand it yourself first," she said. "And I need to understand it myself first," he agreed. She stood steadier than she'd been in the umbilical, steadier than she'd been on the bridge. The 11,000-year body finding itself hour by hour, and together, they walked toward the hydroponics bay, leaving Unit 7 green and ready in the silence of the stasis bay corridor. The row of occupied pods beside it unchanged and unchanging, the people inside them carrying no knowledge of the last 5 days, the component from Storage Bay 4 doing its quiet patient work. The ancient engineering of a civilization that had thought carefully about what its successors would need along the way, providing exactly what it had always been there to provide. The command ship was larger than Destiny, not by the margin that the long-range sensor readings had suggested. Sensors at 3.8 million kilometers produced data that required interpretation, and Eli's interpretations had been conservative in the specific way that interpretations of things that were trying to kill you tended toward the optimistic. Up close, at the 80,000-kilometer observation distance he'd settled on as the minimum safe range for detailed analysis without triggering the command ship's proximity response, the vessel was approximately twice Destiny's mass and built with the aesthetic philosophy of something that had never needed to consider anything except function. No solar collection panels, no gate room, no crew quarters or hydroponics bays or any of the accommodations that biological occupation required. Just the clean, brutal architecture of a machine intelligence that had been doing one thing for millions of years and had optimized its physical form around that one thing until every unnecessary element had been stripped away, and what remained was purpose rendered as structure. It was, Eli thought, looking at it on the enhanced visual feed, genuinely beautiful in the way that very pure things were beautiful. The way an equation was beautiful when every term was necessary and none was redundant. He'd spent the previous evening in the hydroponics bay with Oreva, eating field rations and talking for 4 hours about the choice and what it meant and what the 6 weeks before arrival needed to contain. She described the transformation process in the specific, careful language of someone translating an experience from a register that had no language into the one available, not metaphor exactly, not technical description exactly, but something between the two that her ancient precision and his instinct for pattern recognition had eventually produced a shared vocabulary for. What emerged from the 4 hours was this: the transformation the signal's authors had found was not a technology. It was not something done to a civilization from the outside. It was something a civilization did to itself. A fundamental reorientation of how its members related to each other and to the physical universe. A change in the substrate of collective consciousness that was possible only when the civilization had developed sufficient complexity and had faced sufficient adversity to understand, at the cellular level, what connection actually cost and why the cost was worth paying. The ancients had reached the threshold and looked at it, and chosen ascension because the threshold was painful. The signal's authors had reached the same threshold and gone through it. Going through it looked like nothing from the outside. From the inside, it looked like every person in a civilization simultaneously understanding something they had always almost understood, and finally, completely understanding it. The mechanism at the source, the gatekeeper, was the thing that made this simultaneous. It was a technology in that sense, a focusing instrument. But what it focused on was already present in the civilization that arrived at it. You couldn't bring something to the mechanism that wasn't already in you. It could only reveal what was there. The test was whether what was there was enough. He'd thought about Rush while she talked, about Rush carrying the weight of what he'd decoded for 4 months because he'd decided the crew couldn't bear it. He'd thought about what Rush had gotten wrong, not the assessment of the information's weight, which was accurate, but the conclusion drawn from it. The crew couldn't bear it in the way that people couldn't bear most things, which was to say they could, they would, they had already borne everything else, and the weight of this would be the same as every other weight, real, significant, and manageable, because managed things were what people were. He'd fallen asleep in his chair in the hydroponics bay at some point after midnight ship time, and Oreva had apparently let him sleep. And he'd woken at 0600 to find her at the hydroponics bay console running the archive seed ship inventory through Destiny's cross-referencing system, already working. The ancient morning routine, apparently not requiring the transition time that his human one did. The approach to the command ship was Oreva's plan, which he'd stress-tested for 3 hours and found sound at every point he'd been able to find a point to stress. The recall signal had brought the drones back to the command ship for a system check that the command ship's own logic recognized as procedurally necessary. The system check would keep the drone units in a maintenance configuration for the duration of the recall window docked, running diagnostics, not available for deployment. This meant approaching the command ship in the shuttle during the recall window was as safe as approaching the command ship would ever be, which was the same as saying it was as safe as it wasn't, which was the honest assessment. The shuttle approach needed to read as non-threatening. Oreva had been specific about this. The command ship's proximity protocols classified incoming vessels by drive signature, velocity profile, and the specific energy output patterns associated with weapons systems. A shuttle approaching at low velocity with no weapons hot and no evasive maneuvering read as non-threatening in the command ship's threat taxonomy. A shuttle approaching at attack speed with weapons charging read as a threat and would be met as one. Approach slowly, she had said, the ancient understatement, carrying all the emphasis it needed. Do not make any movement that could be interpreted as aggressive. The system is very literal. How literal? He'd asked. I once saw it classify a startled physical flinch as an aggressive gesture and respond accordingly, she'd said. Literal. He'd ask her to elaborate. She'd described an incident from 11,000 years ago in the flat declarative of someone reporting a fact. And the incident had been sufficiently instructive that he'd spent the subsequent hour reviewing every physical movement he might make in the shuttle and its potential classification in a system that was very literal. They launched at 0800 ship time. The shuttle was small and cold and smelled of the specific combination of metal and recycled atmosphere that all small enclosed spaces on ancient vessels eventually produced. And Eli flew it at the speed that Areva had calculated as optimally non-threatening, slow enough that the approach would take 40 minutes, and fast enough that it wouldn't read as hesitant, which the command ship apparently also classified as a threat indicator in the specific way of a system that had been designed by very careful people who had thought about every possible failure mode, including the failure mode of being too careful. Areva sat in the co-pilot seat and monitored the command ship's sensor output on the shuttle's instruments, reading the ancient frequency data with the native fluency of someone for whom this was not interpretation but recognition. They talked during the 40 minutes because silence in a small vessel approaching a machine intelligence that was very literal seemed like the wrong choice for both of their psychological states. "Tell me about when you were placed on the siege ship," he said. She was quiet for a moment, not reluctant processing. He was learning to distinguish the two. "It was not voluntary in the way that things are voluntary when you have full information," she said finally. "I was asked. I understood what was being asked. I did not fully understand what 11,000 years would mean, because nobody could fully understand that in advance. But you said yes." "I said yes, because the alternative was nobody carrying the coordinates. And nobody carrying the coordinates meant destiny arriving at the source without the information it needed. And destiny arriving without the information meant the mechanism testing for unity in a crew that hadn't been prepared, and finding what it found." And she paused. "The consequences of that were made clear to me." "What are the consequences?" Eli said. "If the test fails, the mechanism does not destroy the civilization that fails. It simply does not open. Destiny continues. The crew continues. Life continues. But the choice is not available again. You do not get a second approach." "One shot," Eli said. "The signal's authors were not casual about what they built," she said. "They understood that making the transformation accessible to civilizations that were not ready would be more harmful than making it inaccessible. The restriction is not punitive. It is protective." He thought about this for a while, watching the command ship grow on the shuttle's visual feed, a slow growth, the non-threatening approach speed, making the closing distance feel abstract until the details of the hull began to resolve, and the scale of the thing became concrete in the specific way that scale became concrete when you were approaching it in something small. "Are we ready?" he said. "Destiny's crew, in your assessment." She looked at the command ship. She looked at the sensor readings. She looked at him. "I have been watching Destiny from the siege ship for the last 3 years," she said. "The archive has been monitoring your communications and your records since the ship came into sensor range. I have read every log entry. I have observed every major decision your crew has made." She paused. "You are not a unified people in the way that comfortable civilizations are unified. You are unified in the way that people are unified when the alternative is falling apart, which is the only kind of unity that means anything." He looked at the command ship and thought about Young and Rush in the desert on that alien planet, and what had happened there, and what had happened after, and what the after said about both of them. He thought about Chloe sitting with the thing growing in her cells and deciding to keep going. He thought about Greer and Scott and every member of the crew who had faced the specific daily decision to continue when continuing was the harder choice. "Okay," he said. "Okay." The command ship filled the viewport. The docking port was where Areva said it would be a maintenance access point on the command ship's ventral surface, designed for the physical interface operations that the command ship's builders had understood would eventually be necessary. It accepted the shuttle's docking collar with the automatic response of a system that recognized the approach as a maintenance operation rather than a boarding and responded accordingly, which was the correct response and the response they needed. The airlock cycled. They entered. The interior of the command ship was nothing like Destiny. There were no corridors designed for biological occupation. The passages they moved through were access tunnels, sized for maintenance rather than habitation. Lit in the flat functional blue of a system that had no reason to make its light comfortable, the air was breathable. The atmospheric systems maintained a biological compatible environment as a baseline design feature. The same careful thinking that had built the recall protocol and the reset failsafe and every other accommodation to the possibility of biological interaction. Whoever had designed this system had thought about everything. The primary interface terminal was 300 meters into the ship, at the geometric center of the command architecture, the location that maximized the interface's access to every system simultaneously. Oriva navigated without hesitation, her memory of the design specifications intact across 11,000 years, her hands occasionally trailing the access tunnel walls in the specific way of someone confirming a familiar space. He followed and watched and stayed very still in his movements, in the way of someone who was being very literal about not being aggressive. The terminal was a column of ancient crystal and metal approximately 2 meters tall, its surface active with the pulsing data flow of a system running at continuous operational capacity. The interface points were standard ancient design, the same fundamental language as every interface he'd spent 2 years learning. Oriva stood before it. "The sequence is 12 steps," she said. "I will execute steps 1 through 9. Step 10 requires a biological signature from someone who is not me. The failsafe requires 2 distinct biological authorities to prevent single-point manipulation. Steps 11 and 12 I will complete after your input." "What does step 10 require me to do?" Eli said. "Place your hand on the secondary interface point and hold it while the system reads your biological signature. Approximately 30 seconds. Do not move during the read." 30 seconds of not moving, he said. "I can do that." "I know," she said. "You have been very still this entire time." He almost smiled. He held it very literal. She began the sequence. Steps 1 through 9 took 11 minutes, her hands moving through the interface with the precision of someone executing a procedure from memory that was 11,000 years old and completely intact. Each step producing a visible response in the terminal's data flow. The system's behavior changing in incremental ways that his eye parsed as something moving from one state toward another state. The long, slow process of a machine intelligence receiving a reset signal it had been built to accept and following the protocol its creators had specified. At step 9, the terminal's pulsing slowed. Not stopped, slowed. The data flow shifting from the continuous high-frequency pattern of active operation to something more deliberate. The system paying attention to itself in a way it didn't usually have reason to do. "Now?" Eli said. "Now," she said. He placed his hand on the secondary interface point. The read was not what he'd expected. He'd expected 30 seconds of nothing biological data transfer, passive, a sensor taking a measurement. What he got instead was 30 seconds of something that was not quite communication and not quite sensation, but occupied the space between them. A presence in the interface, a quality of attention directed at him specifically. The terminal's ancient intelligence, doing something that its creators had apparently built into step 10 that Oriva hadn't mentioned, or hadn't known, or had known and decided he would understand better in the experience than in the description. It was reading more than his biology. He didn't know how he knew this. He knew it the way you knew things. That your instruments couldn't measure in the body, in the specific quality of being perceived rather than scanned, the difference between a medical sensor and a person looking at you. The 30 seconds ended. He withdrew his hand. Oriva completed steps 11 and 12. The terminal's data flow shifted a complete change. The high-frequency operational pattern replaced by something slower and deeper. The system's fundamental operating state, moving from the configuration it had maintained for millions of years to the configuration its creators had specified as the correct one. Not shut down, reset. The drones, docked in their maintenance bays, received the corrected programming simultaneously the error that had been flagged before Destiny's launch and never corrected finally, quietly, 11,000 years late, addressed. The command ship's threat classification system updated. Destiny moved from Threat Eliminate to Mission Asset Protect. The change took 4 seconds. Areva stood at the terminal for a long moment after it completed, her hands still at the interface. Her expression carrying something he hadn't seen on her face before, the specific quality of a task that had been waited for so long that its completion didn't feel like relief, but like the end of a wait whose presence had become so constant it had stopped being registered as wait. "Is that it?" Eli said. "That is it," she said. "The drones won't come after Destiny anymore." "The drones will escort Destiny," she said. "That is what they were originally designed to do. Protect the mission. They have been trying to eliminate the mission for 3 years because of an error. Now they will do what they were built for." He looked at the terminal. He looked at the access tunnel behind them leading back to the shuttle. He looked at Areva. "You've been waiting to do that for 11,000 years, he said. "Yes," she said. "How does it feel?" She considered this with the honesty she brought to every question. "Like something that needed doing is done," she said, "and like there is still more that needs doing." She turned from the terminal and began walking back toward the shuttle. "That is how it always feels. I have learned not to expect otherwise." He followed her back through the access tunnels, past the flat functional blue lights and the maintenance conduits, and the architecture of a machine intelligence that had been corrected after millions of years of running on a known error, and thought about all the things that ran on known errors, systems and institutions and individual people, operating in configurations that everyone understood were wrong and nobody had fixed because the fix required something nobody had time for, until the time arrived and the fix got done and the system updated and the weight of the error stopped pressing on everything downstream of it. He thought about what 5 months of FTL travel contained. The conversations that needed to happen, the things that needed to be said and understood before Destiny arrived at the source and the mechanism tested for the unity that was either there or wasn't. He thought about waking the crew. He thought about Young's face when he explained what had happened while they slept. Rush's face when he found out that someone had read his files. Chloe's face when she learned what her Nakai biology had been reaching toward in the ship's systems. The thing that Areva had explained the previous evening as the ancient architecture recognizing a compatible consciousness and beginning the slow process of interface that would matter enormously in the 6 weeks before arrival. He thought about all of them, every person in the stasis bay, and what they'd already been through, and what they'd built from it, and what that building meant in the context of what was waiting at the end. He thought Areva was right. They were unified in the way that mattered. Not the easy unity of agreement, the hard unity of people who had seen the worst of each other and stayed anyway, who had made the wrong calls and the right ones and lived in the consequences of both, who had been billions of light years from home for 3 years and had made something from that distance that was worth more than the home they'd left. The shuttle docked to Destiny's hull with the solid resonant sound of return. He sat in the pilot's seat after the airlock cycled, and before he opened the internal door and looked at the shuttle's simple instrument panel for a moment. Then he opened his tablet and navigated to the stasis bay controls. He pulled up the revival sequence for Colonel Everett Young, the full protocol, all 47 steps. The process that would bring a man back from suspended animation and return to him the consciousness and the command authority and the awareness of a situation that had developed considerably since he'd gone under. He looked at the sequence for a long time. Then he looked at the message field at the top of the revival protocol, the text display that the occupant would see in the first seconds of consciousness before full orientation returned. The system's provision for the one thing you most needed to know when you woke up from something like this. He typed in the field. The message was short. It was the most honest thing he could write, and the most useful and the thing that Young would need before anything else in the sequence of things that needed to be understood. It said, "We're okay. I fixed the pod. There's a lot to tell you. Take your time waking up. Eli." He looked at it for a moment. He thought about adding more. He decided against it. More could wait. More was exactly the thing that could wait, and the message said what it needed to say in the space available. He confirmed the revival sequence. He heard, 4 corridors away, the soft hydraulic sound of a stasis pod beginning to open. Young came back slowly. This was not unusual. Stasis revival protocols were designed for gradual return, the biological systems coming online in the order that minimized stress on a nervous system that had been running at the threshold of function for however long it had been running there. What was unusual was the specific quality of Young's return, the way it differed from the revivals Eli had observed before. Those had been emergency revivals people brought back fast because something needed them. The protocol accelerated past its comfortable pace by operational necessity, the returning consciousness having to organize itself in the context of a crisis that was already underway. This was different. Nobody was shooting at them. Nothing was on fire. The stasis bay was quiet, and the corridor outside it was quiet, and the ship around it was quiet. In the particular way, it had been quiet for the last 18 days, the working quiet of Eli and Areva moving through it, talking and thinking and fixing and preparing. A quiet that had texture and direction rather than the flat absence of the first hours after the bay doors had closed. Young lay in the open pod and breathed and let his nervous system do its work. Eli sat on the floor beside the pod, back against the stasis bay wall, and waited. He'd brought water and 2 field rations, and the tablet with the summary document he'd spent 3 days writing the account of everything that had happened since the doors closed, organized in the order that made the most logical sense rather than the chronological order, which was the order that made the least sense because chronological order would have required Young to understand each development before the context for it had been established. He'd written it and rewritten it twice and shown it to Areva, who had read it with her characteristic complete attention and said it was accurate, and said the section about Rush's files should come earlier, and said the section about the transformation should come last because that was the section that required everything else as foundation. He'd reorganized it accordingly. Young's eyes opened at the 14-minute mark. They were the eyes of someone who had been a commander for long enough that even the return from suspension carried the specific quality of assessment taking in the ceiling, the bay, the row of occupied pods, the 1 empty pod 2 units down, and finally Eli sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and the expression of someone who had been waiting for this particular moment for 18 days and was now, with its arrival, experiencing the specific mixture of relief and responsibility that came with the end of a watch. Young looked at him. "How long?" His voice was the rough, low sound of vocal cords reactivating. 18 days since the bay closed, Eli said. "You've been under for all of it except the last 40 minutes. Young absorbed this in the way he absorbed operational information completely, without the processing lag of someone who needed time to accept a fact before they could work with it. He sat up slowly. The stasis system's revival supports adjusting around him, and looked at the bay with the methodical attention of a commander taking inventory. "The crew," he said. "All 83, Eli said. "Everyone's fine. The pods are all green." He paused. "Unit 7 is green." Young looked at Unit 7's panel. Green, the full operational green that it hadn't been when the doors had closed, the color of a thing that had been broken and was now fixed. His expression moved through something that wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite the thing that came after relief, but was somewhere in the geography between them. He looked back at Eli. "How?" he said. "There's a document," Eli said. He held up the tablet. "But the short version is, Seed Ship, spare parts, 11,000-year-old ancient woman who knew where the parts were, and approach 4. End of quote. Young looked at him for a long moment. "An 11,000-year-old ancient woman," he said. "Her name is Areva. She's been awake for 18 days. She's been very helpful." Eli paused. "She's currently on the bridge running a navigational refinement with the data she was carrying. She also helped us fix the drone problem." "The drone. That's in the document too." Eli extended the tablet. "There's a lot in the document." Young took the tablet. He looked at it. He looked at Eli. "Are you okay?" he said. The question landed in the space between them, with the specific weight of a question that was asking something other than its surface meaning. 18 days alone. The oxygen math. The sealed section, and the seed ship, and the umbilical, and the command ship, and the revival of an 11,000-year-old person, and all the conversations with Areva about what was waiting at the end of the journey. Young was asking the surface question and the question underneath it, both at once, in the way that people who had been through things together asked questions when they came back to consciousness after 18 days of not knowing. Eli thought about the answer. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." He paused. "I fixed the pod." Young looked at Unit 7's green panel again. "You fixed the pod," he said. "I fixed the pod," Eli said. Young nodded once, the specific nod of a commander receiving a report that exceeded the expected parameters and choosing to acknowledge it without making it into something ceremonial, because making it ceremonial would have changed what it was. What it was Eli Wallace, alone on an ancient ship with 3 weeks of oxygen and a broken stasis pod and 83 people counting on him, doing what needed doing, because it needed doing, and he was the one there to do it. That was the report. The nod was the acknowledgement. "Tell me about Areva," Young said. Eli told him. Not everything the document would do the detailed work, but the shape of it, the outline, the elements that Young needed to orient to before the document's specifics would be legible. The seed ship, the archive, the 11,000 years, the coordinates she carried and the warning she carried and what both meant for the 6 weeks ahead. Young listened with the quality of attention that had always been the thing Eli respected most about him, not the authority or the command instincts or the tactical competence, all of which were real and significant. But this, the ability to be genuinely present for information that was complicated and uncomfortable, and to let it be what it was without managing it into something more convenient. When Eli finished, Young was quiet for a long moment. "The transformation," he said. "What she described. The choice." "Yeah," Eli said. "That has to be the crew's decision," Young said. "Every person." "I know," Eli said. That's exactly the point. That's what the mechanism tests for, whether we're capable of making it together." Young looked at the row of occupied pods, the 82 people still sleeping, the people he'd commanded for 3 years, through every impossible thing this ship had offered. The crew that had been broken apart and put back together so many times that the breaking and the putting back together had become indistinguishable from the shape of them. Rush knew, Young said. It was not a question. Most of it, Eli said. He decoded the signal's outer layers. He didn't have the final coordinates, or the warning, or the details about the mechanism. But he knew the signal was more than a message, and he knew what the destination implied. And Eli paused. He decided not to tell anyone. Young's expression did the specific thing it did when he was processing information about Rush, the complicated internal negotiation between the version of Rush that had tried to leave him on a planet and the version that had come back, and the version that had been present for everything in between. The ongoing impossible arithmetic of a relationship that had been adversarial and functional and necessary and damaging, and somewhere underneath all of those things, deeply, uncomfortably human. He was trying to protect the crew, Young said. Yeah, Eli said. He was wrong about what the crew needed, but he was trying. Young nodded slowly. He looked at the document on the tablet. He looked at the pods. He looked at the stasis bay doorway and the corridor beyond it, quiet and amber-lit, and carrying the particular atmosphere of a ship that had been tended carefully for 18 days by the people who were left to tend it. Wake Rush next, he said. Eli looked at him. He decoded most of this himself, Young said. He's been carrying it for 4 months. He should be in the room when we start figuring out what to do with it. A pause. And I'd rather have that conversation with him sooner than later. Eli looked at Rush's pod, 2 units down from Young's, the panel green, the man inside it still, and suspended and carrying, even in unconsciousness, the particular density of someone whose mind was always doing something. Okay, he said. He stood up. He moved to Rush's pod and pulled up the revival sequence and typed in the message field. He thought about it for a moment. The message said, "Your files are read. Your math was right. We're 6 months out. There's more than you knew." Eli. He confirmed the sequence. Rush came back faster than Young had, not because the protocol was accelerated, but because Nicholas Rush's nervous system apparently treated the return from suspension the way it treated everything else, as a problem to be solved at maximum speed. His eyes were open at 9 minutes and focused at 10, and by 12, he was sitting up and reading the document on the tablet that Eli had placed in his hands before the vocal cords had fully come online. He read for 22 minutes. Young sat on the other side of the bay and watched him read with the patient attention of a man who had decided something and was waiting for the moment to say it. Rush finished reading. He looked up. His eyes went to Young first, the automatic orientation of a relationship that had always, regardless of everything else, organized itself around the axis of their conflict, then to Eli, then to the document, and back up. "Oreva is on the bridge," Rush said. His voice carried the specific flatness of someone processing at depth. "Yes," Eli said. She decoded the final layer. "She was given the final layer," Eli said, "directly, by whoever sent the signal." Rush looked at this information from several angles simultaneously in the way that was visible on his face, if you knew what to look for. Eli knew what to look for. "The transformation," Rush said. "Read the section again," Young said. "We'll talk after." Rush read the section again. He was quiet for longer this time, the quiet of someone whose internal processing had hit something that required more than speed to work through, something that required the slower mechanism of reckoning, of letting a thing be true, and following the truth to where it led. When he looked up the second time, his expression had changed in the specific way it changed when Rush had arrived somewhere he hadn't expected to arrive. "I was wrong," he said. It was not a performance. It was not the careful, managed admission of someone protecting a position while appearing to concede it. It was the flat declarative of a man who had applied his most rigorous standard to a prior conclusion and found it failed the standard, and was reporting the result with the same precision he brought to any finding. Young looked at him. "Yes," Young said. "You were." A silence. Not hostile, the specific silence of two people who had been in conflict for long enough that the conflict had become a form of communication, and who were now communicating something in the mode of the conflict, without the conflict. "The crew needed to know," Rush said. "The crew needed to know," Young confirmed. I thought Rush stopped. He looked at the document. He looked at the occupied pods. I thought the weight of it would break something. The responsibility. I thought we were already at our limit, and this would push past it. "We were at our limit," Young said. "We're always at our limit. That's not the same as being broken." Rush looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "It's not the same." They woke the crew over the next 4 days. Not all at once in groups of 10, the revival protocols running in staggered sequences that allowed the medical team to manage each batch before the next began. Volker and Park and the others moving through the bay with the focused efficiency of people doing the thing they were trained for. Eli and Young and Rush and Oreva met each group as they came back to consciousness, providing the briefing in the order the document specified, answering questions in the order they arose, and the questions arose in every order, because 83 people returning from suspended animation and encountering the situation that had developed while they slept produced 83 individual versions of the same fundamental experience. Some people needed time. Some people needed to ask the same question multiple times from different angles before the angle that made it legible appeared. Some people Greer, most predictably, but also Ray and James, and 2 or 3 others Eli wouldn't have predicted took the information about the choice, and the transformation, and the mechanism, and the 6 weeks ahead, with the specific equanimity of people for whom the threshold of the transformation, unbelievable, had been moved so many times that its current location was not where most people kept it. Chloe came back in the 3rd group. Eli had thought about this, about how to tell her what Oreva had explained about her biology, the Nakai modifications that had been changing her cells, the ancient architecture and Destiny's systems that had been reaching toward those changes for 2 years, building a connection that Oreva had described as the most significant development aboard the ship since the mission launched, and that nobody had understood because nobody had the context for it. He hadn't needed to manage it. Chloe had come back from suspension, read the document, and then asked to meet Oreva not with the wariness of someone approaching a threat, but with the directness of someone who had been living with an unanswered question for 2 years and could see, in the document, the outline of the answer. Their first conversation lasted 3 hours and happened in the hydroponics bay, in the chairs that had become Eli and Oreva's chairs over 18 days of evening conversations. And Eli was not present for it because it was not his conversation to be present for. He sat on the bridge and ran navigational checks and thought about what it meant that 2 people from 11,000 years apart could sit in a hydroponics bay and find the shared vocabulary for something that neither of them had been able to fully articulate before the other existed. Rush spent the 4 days in the research lab, not hiding, present for every briefing, available for questions, contributing to the crew discussions with the specific quality of someone who had put down a weight and was experiencing the changed relationship with his own capacity that came with the putting down. But also working, because Rush without work was an entity that didn't exist and wouldn't have been healthy if it did, and the work he was doing in the research lab with Oreva's coordinates and his own decoded data and the new framework that her direct knowledge provided was producing, by the end of the 4 days, a navigational and theoretical picture of the approach to the source that was the most complete and precise analysis of Destiny's mission that had ever existed. He presented it to the full crew on the 5th day. The gate room, the only space on Destiny large enough to hold everyone, had not been used for a full crew assembly since the last major crisis, which meant it carried the atmospheric memory of that occasion and needed the weight of this one to layer over it. 83 people in a circle, the way they'd done everything on this ship. The configuration that had become the visual language of Destiny's crew for decisions that belonged to all of them. Rush stood at the center. He presented the analysis without performance, just the data, the conclusions, the implications, in the order of logical necessity, with the specific clarity of someone who had been thinking about this for months and had finally arrived at the version of it that was true all the way through. The signal, the source, the coordinates, the mechanism, the transformation, the choice. He presented it the way he would have presented any finding. Here is what we know, here is what it means, here is what it requires. When he finished, the gate room was quiet in the specific way of a large group of people sitting with something that was too large for an immediate response. Then Greer said, from the 4th row, "So we've been heading toward the most important thing in the history of the universe for 3 years, and we're just finding out about it now." "Yes," Rush said, "and we've got 6 weeks to decide if we want to go through with it." "Yes." Greer looked at the people around him. He looked at Young. He looked at Eli. He looked at Rush with the specific expression he reserved for Rush, which had always contained within it a complex mixture of distrust and reluctant respect that 2 years had not resolved into anything simpler. "I've got questions," Greer said. "So do I," said Volker. "And I," said Ray. The questions came for 2 hours, genuine ones, the kind that required real answers, the kind that pushed against the edges of what was known and tested the consistency of the picture at its joints. Rush answered every one with the same honesty he'd brought to the presentation, including the questions he couldn't fully answer, including the question from Park about whether the transformation was reversible. "I don't know, the data doesn't address it." Oreva doesn't know either, and the question from Brody about what it felt like from the inside. "I can only report what the signals record describes, which is that it feels like understanding something you have always almost understood." Oreva answered the questions directed at her in the ancient to English translation that had become their working mode, Eli occasionally supplementing when the translation matrix produced something that needed interpretation rather than just rendering. After 2 hours, the questions had not stopped, but had changed quality, moving from the interrogative mode of people testing a claim toward the exploratory mode of people who had accepted the claim and were beginning to think inside it. Young called a recess. The individual conversations happened over the next week. The formal discussion in the gate room gave way to the informal discussions in corridors and the mess and the hydroponics bay and the research lab and every other space on a ship that had never been big enough for privacy and had therefore become a ship where every space was potentially a space for the things that needed saying. People talked to each other and to Oreva and to Rush and to Young, and to Eli. And the conversations were not always comfortable and not always conclusive, but they were real, which was the thing the mechanism was testing for the capacity of this group to engage with the hardest question honestly and collectively and reach a place that was theirs. Eli moved through all of it and said less than he might have, because his instinct was to help people reason rather than to provide the reasoning, and because the choice was theirs and needed to feel like theirs, and because the most useful thing he'd learned in 18 days alone was that presence was sometimes more valuable than contribution. He talked to Rush once, privately, in the research lab at the end of the second week. Rush was at his console running the final navigational calculations, the ones that would produce the precise approach vector for the last 3 weeks of travel. He looked up when Eli came in with the expression of someone who had been expecting this conversation. "The files," Rush said. "The files," Eli said. "You read everything." "Everything," Eli confirmed, "including what it means." Rush was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong to withhold it," he said. "I've said that to Young. I should say it to you directly." "You were trying to protect people," Eli said. "You just got the method wrong." "The method was paternalistic," Rush said, with a specific self-assessment of someone who had been examining a prior decision under his most rigorous standard and was reporting the finding without softening it. "I decided what people could bear." "That's not mine to decide." "No," Eli said, "but you were also carrying something that felt unbearable. I know what that's like. 18 days of it gives you perspective." Rush looked at him. "How did you manage?" Rush said. Not performing the question, genuinely asking, the specific curiosity of a man who processed difficulty alone as a default and was, for the first time in Eli's experience of him, asking about someone else's method. "I talked to the archive," Eli said, "and then I talked to Ariva, and when I ran out of people to talk to, I talked to the empty ship, which sounds insane but helped." Rush looked at this information for a moment. "I should have talked to the crew," he said. "Yeah," Eli said. "We tend to do better when we do that." A silence. Not uncomfortable, the silence of two people who had arrived at a shared understanding from very different directions and were sitting in the arrival. "The mechanism will test us in 4 weeks, Rush said. "Yes," Eli said. "Do you think we'll pass?" Eli thought about the gate room assembly and the 2 hours of questions and the individual conversations and the specific quality of the crew's engagement with the hardest thing they'd ever been asked to engage with. He thought about Young and Rush in the same room, without the conflict that had defined their relationship for 3 years. He thought about Chloe and Areva in the hydroponics bay finding their shared vocabulary. He thought about Greer's first question, not, "What does this mean for my survival?" but, "So we've been heading toward the most important thing in the history of the universe," which was the question of someone whose orientation was outward rather than inward, whose first instinct was toward the significance of things rather than the safety of himself. He thought about the archive, alone for 3 million years, and what it had said. "You are the one who stays when others cannot." "Yeah," he said. "I think we'll pass." The final approach to the source began 3 weeks later. Destiny dropped out of FTL at the coordinates that Areva's memory and Rush's calculations had converged on, and the thing that resolved on the main screen was not what any of them had expected, and also was not something that could have been expected, because the categories required to expect it didn't exist in any framework they'd brought with them. It was a point of light, not a star, not the nuclear fusion of ordinary stellar matter, not the spectrum of any known physical process. A point of light that existed at the coordinates and nowhere else, that the sensors described in the vocabulary of things they couldn't categorize, that Destiny's own navigation system responded to by going quiet, not offline, not damaged. Quiet in the specific way of a system that had arrived at the destination it had been designed to reach and had nothing further to add. The ship had been moving toward this point for millions of years. The crew of Destiny looked at it through the main screen for a long time without speaking. Then Young said from the command chair, "All right." He looked at Areva. "What do we do?" he said. "Nothing yet," she said. "The mechanism will reach out when it is ready. It reads the ship before it reads the crew. It has been reading Destiny for a long time." She paused. "Millions of years." "And then?" Young said. "And then It will present the choice to everyone. Simultaneously, each person will understand what they are being asked. Each person will answer. No coercion, Young said. No coercion, she confirmed. The mechanism cannot be influenced. It cannot be argued with. It will read what is there and respond to what it finds. Young nodded. He looked at the point of light. He looked at his crew, the 83 people arranged across the bridge and the observation deck above it, and visible in the gate room through the open corridor. Everyone present, everyone here. The full complement of Destiny's impossible, improbable crew gathered at the end of the journey they'd been on since a 9-chevron address had been dialed in a cave on another planet. Eli stood beside Rush. Rush stood beside Chloe. Greer stood with Scott and James and the others in the configuration they'd always unconsciously adopted when things were serious, not tactical, not defensive, just together. The arrangement of people who had learned each other's positions in a room. The point of light pulsed once. Everyone felt it, not through the ship's systems, not through any instrument, but directly. The mechanism making contact in the way that Areva had described, and that was, nevertheless, in the actual experience of it, beyond the description, a presence. Clean, and vast, and ancient, and patient, in the way of something that had been waiting for this specific configuration of people for millions of years and had never doubted they would arrive. It was asking. Not in language. In the thing underneath language, the direct apprehension of a question without the mediation of words, the question itself, rather than any expression of it. Simple, complete. The most important question and the simplest one, and the one that Eli had been thinking about in various forms since the stasis bay doors had closed 18 days into the journey, and he'd stood in the corridor and decided that the problem was solvable. What are you for? Eli stood in the answer for a moment. He thought about his mother on Earth who didn't know where he was. He thought about the archive that had been alone for 3 million years and had said thank you for coming. He thought about Rush's 3 paragraphs, and the word responsibility, and what the word meant when you'd finally understood it completely. He thought about Young's nod in the stasis bay, and what was conveyed in the nod, and why it had been enough. He knew his answer. He thought everyone in this room knew theirs. He thought the answers were going to be the same answer, said in 83 different ways, which was what unity was, not one voice, but many voices, finding the same true thing. The point of light pulsed again. Destiny waited. They answered. The Stargate program's official records, the classified files maintained by the SGC and IOA in the vaults at Cheyenne Mountain, updated by astropathic communication, and the fragmented data bursts that Destiny had managed to transmit across the billions of light years between them and home, contain an entry dated to the period of Destiny's final approach. Coordinates that is classified above top secret, at a level that has no public designation. The entry is brief. It describes the receipt of a final transmission from Destiny, a data burst of unusual size and composition that the SGC's best analysts spent 3 years attempting to fully decode. Most of it they decoded. Some of it they could not because the encryption was beyond them, but because the content described experiences for which their analytical frameworks had no adequate vocabulary. What they decoded told them this. Destiny had arrived. The crew was intact. The mission's purpose, obscured for millions of years behind the scale of its own ambition, had been revealed and faced and engaged with by 83 human beings, billions of light years from Earth, who had been given no preparation for it, except the preparation of everything they'd already survived. The transmission ended with a personal message addressed to no specific recipient, filed in the data burst as a general record rather than a directed communication, the kind of thing you sent when you wanted it to reach whoever it needed to reach. It said, "We did what we came to do. It wasn't what any of us expected. I'm not sure it ever is. The ship is quiet now, a different kind of quiet than before. Not the quiet of people waiting for the next thing to go wrong, but the quiet of people who have arrived somewhere and are taking a breath before figuring out what being here means." I want to say something to whoever reads this, from wherever you are, in whatever time this reaches you. The journey was the hard part, and also the point. The thing at the end was real, and we got there, and it was worth it. But what made it possible, the only thing that made it possible, was the part that happened in between. The days and the crises and the losses and the conversations in the hydroponics bay at midnight, the people who stayed, the problems that got solved because they had to be solved and someone was there to solve them. If you're reading this, you're probably still in the in-between. So am I, in a way. We all are. Always. Stay in it. Do the work. Talk to the people you're with. The rest follows. Eli Wallace, aboard the ancient vessel Destiny, somewhere beyond the edge of everywhere we've been.